Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're drifting off beneath heavy blankets, letting the hum of the road fill your thoughts, or simply searching for quiet in a noisy world, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're following the earliest traces of shelter, to ask how the very first Americans built homes on a raw and trembling continent. This is slow storytelling for the minds that never stopped wondering. It's an untold chapter in the story of us, the building of human homes 15,000 years ago, drawn against the cold breath of retreating glaciers and shaped by wind, earth, and silence. But it begins not with blueprints or bricks, but with a question. What does it mean to belong somewhere when nothing has ever belonged to you? Oh, and if you're someone who enjoys thoughtful history, deep time, and soft storytelling, look just below this video. There's a button that says subscribe. Tap it if you'd like. You can unsubscribe anytime. And that bell icon next to it. Tapping that means you'll know when new journeys arrive. Subscribing truly matters. It helps this channel survive. Without it, new stories can't be made. If these stories bring you calm, you can tap the super thanks under this video. It truly helps keep these prehistoric journeys alive. And I wonder, where are you listening from? What time is it there? If you feel like sharing, drop it in the comments. A quiet reminder that we're all here together. Also, feel free to drift off. Chapters are listed below if you need them. Now we begin, with a land that had never known footsteps. The question is simple, but haunting. How did the first Americans build homes 15,000 years ago? Before walls, before names, before even the memory of stone towns or written words, how did human beings shelter themselves when the land was raw, the air razor cold, and the continent itself untouched by human breath? We begin here not with the answer, but with the silence before the question. A time when the ground that would one day be called the Americas still slumbered beneath ice, when the winds curled across an unmarked geography, and the only structures were those of snowdrifts, glaciers, and bone. To understand how humans first began to shape shelter from chaos, we must begin with the land itself, not as we know it, but as it was. 15,000 years ago, the world was still unravelling from the grip of the last glacial maximum. This was the twilight of the Pleistocene, an epoch defined by its violence and silence, its colossal life and creeping ice. The Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets blanketed much of what is now Canada and the northern United States, towering with a frozen indifference that reached miles into the sky. Beneath them, the earth groaned under a weight it had carried for millennia. But now something was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the climate shifted. Why? The answer lies in the rhythm of the Earth itself. Orbital cycles, known as Milankovitch cycles, were shifting again, altering the balance of solar energy the planet received. This celestial choreography, the tilt, wobble, and ellipse of Earth's journey around the Sun, had triggered the Ice Age in the first place. And now it was inviting spring. Not a seasonal spring, but a planetary one. The ice began to melt. Rivers, long frozen in stasis, found movement. Valleys, pressed flat under tons of pressure, began to rise again like something awakening. The land beneath the ice was not dead, it was merely waiting. But who was watching this thaw? Who was listening to the groan of glaciers cracking and the hush of snow turning to rain? Somewhere to the northwest, perhaps standing on the edge of what is now Siberia, a human being looked out across a sea of frozen possibility. And they stepped forward, not all at once, and not in haste. The journey into the Americas was not a conquest, but a quiet ripple of migration that played out over generations. It is one of the greatest movements in human history, yet it left behind almost no written trace. What kind of courage, or necessity, does it take to walk into a world with no maps, no names, no return? And what was this place they entered? Was it wilderness? Or was it waiting for them? Somewhere in that vast white expanse, the first footprint fell, not marked in stone, not carved into myth, but in soft soil left bare by a receding glacier. That footprint is where the story of home begins. It was not a home of stone or permanence. It did not yet have walls, or even a word for shelter. But for those first human beings, stepping from the known into the unknown, survival was inseparable from shelter. And shelter was inseparable from the land. To understand how the first Americans built homes, we must follow them as they arrived, through the shifting corridors of deep time and shifting continents. The ancient land bridge known as Beringia did not resemble the narrow crossings of storybook migration. It was vast. For thousands of years it spanned as much as 1,000 miles from east to west, connecting Siberia to what is now Alaska, with a breadth wider than many nations. This bridge was not merely a passage, but a landscape, cold, dry, treeless, and yet alive. Herds of mammoth and steppe bison moved through its windswept plains. Arctic foxes, dire wolves, and even lions padded across its tundra. And alongside them, or perhaps always just behind them, came the humans. These early people were not reckless wanderers. They were trackers, memory holders, storytellers. They followed the herds and the seasons. Their ancestors had already crossed thousands of miles through Asia. They knew how to read the sky, how to read the snow. But Beringia offered no easy crossing. It was not just a line on a map, but an ordeal of generations. Some may have stayed for centuries. Evidence suggests that Beringia itself became a homeland of its own, rich in caribou and fish, with people adapted to a cold and wind-blown world. What does it mean to make a home in a place that others would call desolate? Beneath the permafrost and bone-littered soil, we find the remnants of hearths, places where fires burned, where people gathered and slept and remembered. If a home is where warmth meets memory, then these windswept camps were homes too. But the passage did not stop there. As the glaciers slowly receded, new corridors opened. One path, winding between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, may have offered a route south into the heart of the continent. This ice-free corridor theory long dominated scientific thought. But the land remembers things that theories forget. In recent decades, a new possibility has gained ground: the coastal route. Along the edge of the Pacific, as the ice sheets carved and retreated, a ribbon of unglaciated coastline emerged. Here, amid kelp forests and tidal estuaries, people may have travelled by boat or foot, using maritime knowledge that now lies hidden beneath the sea. If this is true, then the first Americans were not just walkers, that they were seafarers, navigators of ice and water following the shorelines of a world still half asleep. Which path did they take? The truth is, we do not know. But perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps what matters more is not how they arrived, but what they brought with them. Memory, fire, the idea that even here in the unknown, a home could still be made. For the first Americans, home was not something built and left behind. It was something carried, in the bones of animals, in the shapes of hide, in the logic of the land. It lived in the way stones were placed around a hearth, in the windbreaks of driftwood, in the hollows chosen for sleeping. These were not structures to last through centuries. They were impermanent, soft-footed like the people themselves, and yet in their simplicity they reveal a profound kind of intelligence, one tuned not to dominion but to listening. What kind of world did these people find when they finally stepped beyond the ice? They entered a continent unscarred by human tool or fire, a land older than memory, where megafauna still roamed in staggering abundance. Mammoths lumbered through grasslands that would one day become farmland. Giant ground sloths moved like slow shadows across what is now the American Southwest. Saber-toothed cats stalked prey beneath open skies. It was a place that seemed outside of time. Mythic, not because it was imagined, but because it was real. And in that raw expanse, everything was possibility. There were no cities, no neighbours, no maps. Every bend of river, every ridge and valley was seen for the first time by human eyes. For a people accustomed to movement, this new world did not demand conquest. It offered invitation. The continent, so often romanticised as empty, was in fact full of sound, of life, of danger, and of promise. And the first humans did not try to reshape it overnight. Instead, they adapted. They watched. They learned where the game travelled, where the seasons turned. They began to name places, not with writing, but with memory and story. And slowly they began to make homes. At first, these shelters may have been as simple as a curve of mammoth ribs covered in hides, a fire pit at the centre, and footprints in the snow outside. We have found these in fragments across the mammoth kill sites of the Great Plains in the Arctic fringe, bones shaped into arcs. Charcoal remains clustered in patterns that suggest not just cooking, but living. In Ukraine and Russia, sites of similar age show entire dwellings made of mammoth bone, circular structures, carefully constructed, walls layered with hide and insulation, oriented to catch or block the wind. It is possible, even likely, that similar techniques were used in the earliest human settlements on this side of the world. But is it enough to call these bones and embers a home? Not in the way we think of home, with keys and locks and permanence. But perhaps that is the illusion. For these people, home was not a place to stay forever. It was a place to return to or to rebuild again and again. It was a hearth more than a house, a memory more than a wall. And in that, perhaps, it was closer to the essence of shelter than we remember. Because what is a home, if not a choice to remain, even for a single night, in a world that offers no guarantee of safety? In this unpeopled land, where thunder cracked over vast, grasslands and unknown animals watched from the brush, every act of rest was an act of faith. To build a fire, to lie down, to close one's eyes, these were not small things, they were declarations. And so, even the humblest shelter, a ring of stones, a canopy of branches, a nest of moss beside a boulder, was layered with meaning. This is where they paused. This is where they gathered. This is where they were not merely surviving, but existing with intent. And for those first humans, the landscape itself was the architecture. Rivers told them where to travel. Hills gave them vantage. Caves, when found, offered both storage and ritual. The earth was not a resource. It was a companion. Some researchers speak now of dwelling as moving, where home is less a place than a sequence of places remembered. Shelter was not something you owned. It was something you returned to. The great mammoth bone circles were built, used, and left, but perhaps not forgotten. Is it possible that even then a child could recognize the shape of a familiar hearth? The archaeological record, sparse and wind-scoured, gives us only clues. Charred bone, flint tools, bits of ochre. These remnants do not whisper in sentences, they murmur in fragments, and yet, from those fragments, patterns emerge. Sites like Monteverde in southern Chile, far older than expected, tell us that humans moved quickly through the Americas, travelling vast distances, not just with desperation, but with skill. They found food, water, shelter, and belonging in landscapes they had never seen. And that is no accident. That is adaptation. Monteverde reveals something else as well. Traces of wooden planks arranged for flooring. Twine, tent-like structures. This was no brief encampment. It was a place of life. And where life settles, even for a short while, shelter is more than a structure. It is an ecosystem of meaning. It carries memory. It holds ritual. It speaks not only to the wind and the rain, but to those who sit around the fire and speak in low voices about where they came from and where they'll go next. What stories were told beneath those early roofs of hide and reed? What lullabies, what fears, what laughter? The first Americans, arriving in waves and webs of migration, did not merely populate a place. They interpreted it. They translated its silence into motion, into pattern, into story. To build a home in a land untouched by human hands was not just an act of engineering, it was an act of imagination, a belief that something could hold you, even when you had never stood there before. And perhaps that belief is what truly built the first shelters. Long before walls were permanent or roofs were raised from cut stone, the first Americans built with trust. Trust in the earth, in the sky, in the cycles that shaped their world. They were not separate from nature, looking out across it as the architects of dominance. They were within it, moving to its rhythms, learning its textures by footstep and firelight. Their shelters, shaped from hide and bone, wood and memory, did not defy the wilderness. They folded into it. Is it possible that this too is a form of architecture? One not drawn in ink, but in instinct. We imagine architecture as permanence, but the story begins in transience. For the people of 15,000 years ago, the land itself was alive, not metaphorically, but sensorially. Mountains told them where weather was coming from. The scent of pine signalled elevation. The movement of herds determined timing. Homes were not planted. They were grown from the circumstances. Each shelter a dialogue between what was carried and what was found. In that way, the Americas did not simply receive people, they conversed with them, and the mystery of that arrival still lingers. We do not know their names, we do not know the words they spoke, but in their dwellings, those faint outlines in soil, those forgotten rings of stone, we see the first spark of what it means to belong, not to a country or a tribe, but to the earth itself. The myth of the untouched continent is persistent, that the Americas were a blank canvas, a waiting stage. But this myth falls apart in the face of evidence. Even the earliest arrivals knew this land not as empty, but as full of spirit, of danger, of promise. They did not conquer it. They conversed with it. They read its signs. They placed their dwellings not where it was easiest, but where it made sense, ecologically, spiritually, communally, and in that they left a different kind of legacy. What happens when we no longer see home as something we impose, but something we discover? These early shelters, ephemeral as wind-blown grass, forgotten by history and unearthed by science, remind us that shelter is not always about walls. Sometimes it is about listening, about presence, about pause, about being willing to stop in the middle of an endless landscape and say, "Here, for now, is enough." That is where the story begins. With a footprint in the thawing soil, with a fire drawn from memory, with a shelter made of what the land offered and what the people carried. 15,000 years ago, on a continent without cities or scripts, the first homes were not declarations of ownership. They were invitations, they were moments, and somehow across all that time they still echo. The land beneath the ice did not wait in silence. It was always listening, and when the first people arrived, it answered. With shelter, with belonging, with the beginning of home. But what if the past had a voice more fragile than stone, softer than tools, fainter than bones? And what if we had only just learned how to listen to it? In a dry, shimmering basin in what is now New Mexico, where winds sweep across alkali flats and the heat wavers like memory itself, scientists found something they did not expect to see. Beneath layers of ancient sediment, laid down when this arid desert was once a fertile lake bed, there were footprints, human footprints, dozens of them, then hundreds, preserved not in fossilized clay or rock, but in the subtle compression of damp ground once stepped on, and then slowly buried, sealed and forgotten. Footprints that had waited more than 20,000 years to be seen again. How does a footprint survive the ages? It doesn't do so by strength, but by miracle, by the precise combination of moisture, silt, erosion, and time. And these weren't just random prints. They were trails, parallel paths, a child walking, slipping, an adult doubling back, someone carrying another, perhaps a toddler, perhaps an elder. There were pauses, there were loops, and there were stories, etched into the earth like whispers. This is White Sands, a place where the dust remembers. For decades the consensus held firm. The first humans arrived in the Americas no earlier than 13,000 years ago. The so-called Clovis culture, named after a distinctive type of stone point found near mammoth remains in New Mexico, was seen as the beginning. Before Clovis, it was assumed there was nothing human. The land was still silent, but these footprints at White Sands shattered that assumption. Radiocarbon dating of seeds trapped within the same sedimentary layers suggests a date as early as 23,000 years ago. If that is true, then our understanding of when and how humans arrived in the Americas is not just incomplete, it is fundamentally wrong. What does it mean when dust corrects your history? The footprints do not come with names. They are not attached to cities or monuments. There are no tools beside them, no banners, no weapons. But in their absence they speak volumes, because this is not conquest. This is movement. This is presence. A record not of war or kingship, but of walking, of living, of choosing to be somewhere. It is the kind of record that civilizations rarely leave behind, and yet it is more human than any wall or statue. These were people who passed through a landscape and left nothing but the soft press of their steps, and somehow it was enough. So what else have we missed? If the earth can hold footprints for 20,000 years, how many stories still lie beneath our feet, waiting not to be unearthed, but to be noticed? And what do we do with a history that begins not with certainty, but with dust? Perhaps we start by letting go of the need for perfection. For decades, the Clovis first model was treated as a kind of archaeological doctrine, a single, origin point from which all human presence in the Americas must have flowed. Defined by finely crafted spear points, Fluted and symmetrical, the Clovis toolkit was the first major technology unearthed in association with the bones of extinct megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths. The narrative was elegant, neat. Around 13,000 years ago, these big game hunters swept southward from Alaska through an ice-free corridor, filling the continent in a wave of innovation and hunger. But elegance is not the same as truth. Even before White Sands, there were whispers, sites that didn't quite fit. Monteverde in southern Chile, where traces of wooden structures, medicinal plants, and hearths pushed the timeline back far enough to make the Clovis first idea wobble. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, the Buttermilk Creek Complex in Texas, Cactus Hill in Virginia, stone tools, cut-marked bones, layers of ash and charcoal, each one a quiet defiance of consensus, each one suggesting that people were here earlier and that their story was not singular. What kind of culture leaves almost no trace and yet traverses continents? The answer may lie not in what was built, but in what was not. There are no ruins from this era, no standing stones, no burial mounds that we can name with certainty. This is not because these people were less sophisticated. It is because they lived in motion, in balance. They were not builders of cities, but shapers of moments. And that kind of life leaves different evidence. Not monuments, but middens. Not palaces, but soot stains, footprints, flint shards, fragments of dreams. And so, archaeologists learn to read the negative space, the gaps between certainty, the places where a hearth leaves behind not stone, but darkened soil. A place once warm, a place once returned to. You begin to ask new questions. Not just, what was built here, but why was nothing left? What does it mean to live in such a way that the land forgets you, and yet still remembers? Was it intentional? A form of ecological humility? Or was it simply the reality of survival in a world that gave, but only in cycles? The absence of architecture is not an absence of culture. It is an adaptation to movement. It speaks of people who knew how to travel light, how to survive through harsh winters, how to know the land deeply without marking it permanently. Their shelters may have been made of hide, snow, brush, driftwood, but they were enough. They were homes that left no scars. What kind of wisdom is required to belong without possession? And how do you measure a civilization that never carved itself into the land, but whispered through it, briefly and beautifully, like wind across tall grass? These early peoples, whose traces we now chase through layers of soil and ash, were not echoes of some more advanced future. They were complete in themselves. Their lives were not preludes to modernity, but alternate answers to the same question we ask today. How do you live in a world you cannot control? What we find over and over is not the architecture of ambition, but the residue of attentiveness. Charcoal halos from hearths built and rebuilt. Debitage, flakes of stone, the soft static left behind by the act of sharpening a blade. Burned seeds, fish bones, a worn patch of ground. To a casual eye, these are nothing, but to those who listen, they are the chords of a forgotten song. It is in these details that we begin to see the outline of lives lived in synchrony with land and time. Clovis, with all its beauty and precision, was once thought to be the opening act, but now it appears to be a chapter midstream. Remarkable, yes, but not singular. Clovis points have been found from the southwest to the eastern seaboard, often associated with mammoth kills or caches of tools. Their craftsmanship is undeniable, their purpose sharp and clear. But Clovis did not arise from nothing. It likely grew from earlier traditions now buried deeper in the sediment, waiting for hands careful enough to find them. If we remove the idea of a single origin, what remains? Something far more human, a mosaic, a patchwork of people arriving at different times by different paths, bringing with them different ways of being. Some may have followed the interior route, slipping between the melting glaciers. Others may have skirted the Pacific coast, in boats made of driftwood and sinew, gathering shellfish from the tidal shallows and sleeping beneath skins stretched on bentwood frames. Still others, perhaps, came in ways we have yet to imagine, following rivers, drawn by stars, guided not by conquest, but by curiosity. And all of them left marks. But their marks are not symmetrical. They are not neat. They do not all point in the same direction. Instead, they scatter like seeds across a continent, carried by wind, by will, by need. And that scattering is what challenges us. because we want history to follow a line. We want a story with a beginning, a hero, a tool, a victory. But the past rarely gives us that. Instead, it offers us footprints in the dust. Parallel, overlapping, pausing, disappearing. Whose were they? A woman walking with a child, a hunter tracking deer through shallow water, a group dispersing after a seasonal gathering. There are thousands of possibilities, and perhaps that is the gift. The realization that history is not always a monument waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes it is a trail, half erased, asking only that we follow it as far as we can, knowing it may lead not to certainty, but to wonder. And perhaps that is the most honest thing we can say about these early inhabitants of the Americas, that they lived lives rich in experience, intention and meaning, while leaving behind only the faintest of physical signatures. No towering ziggurats, no sunken temples, no carved inscriptions, just the subtle trace of motion, the ghost of decision, the residue of presence. And yet, in that sparseness lies their brilliance, for the land did not resist them, it remembered them. Quietly, impermanently, but deeply. What happens when a people choose mobility over monument? In that choice is a philosophy, a worldview that says value lies not in what is possessed, but in what is shared. That permanence is not the same as significance. That moving through a landscape without dominating it is not a failure of culture, but a mastery of it. These early Americans knew how to build homes that the earth would gently take back, without struggle or scars. They left behind stories not in stone, but in practice, in paths travelled, in resources rotated, in fire pits that warmed the same spot again and again, each time as if it were the first. This is why archaeologists learn to listen differently, not with eyes trained for grandeur, but for granularity, a discoloration in the soil, an unnatural scatter of stones, a particular wear pattern on a bone. These become sentences, these become pages in a book without a cover. And in that book we begin to see a kind of architecture of movement, a structure of survival built from knowledge rather than walls. What knowledge does it take to live with the land instead of above it? Imagine the intimacy it requires, to know when the salmon run, not from a calendar, but from the tension in the wind, to follow the migration of elk across valleys you've never seen, guided only by ancestral memory, to find the safest place to build a fire in a forest you met only yesterday. This is not randomness. It is not guesswork. It is inherited perception. It is ecological fluency, passed down not in books but in footsteps and breath and repetition. And this fluency extends to shelter, to knowing how to craft a windbreak from branches, how to bank heat with moss, how to stretch hide so it sings in the rain and breathes in the sun. These were not rough improvisations. They were refinements honed over generations. And yet, because they did not fossilize, we struggle to see them. We confuse the temporary with the primitive. We forget that fragility is often the result of choice, not deficiency. So when we look at the absence of grand structures, perhaps we should not ask, what were they lacking? But instead, what did they understand that we have forgotten? To live without building does not mean to live without beauty or skill or care. It simply means the beauty was of a different kind, one meant to be felt, not photographed, one that faded gently into the earth the way a footprint disappears in wind. And yet, it is these ephemeral traces that now call to us with the greatest urgency, because they speak of a way of living that does not demand permanence in order to have meaning. They speak of humans who were not defined by what they owned or built, but by how they moved, how they adapted, how they endured. In the stillness of abandoned camps, in the pattern of burned seeds, left near forgotten hearths, we begin to see the architecture of presence, not of concrete and timber, but of intention. Even today, the memory of these first walkers survives in echoes, in the soft depressions at White Sands, where the prints of a child walking beside an adult still hold the delicate imprint of toes, in the quiet sediment of Buttermilk Creek, where thousands of stoneflakes suggest a site returned to again and again, as if it were a seasonal home, in the shadows of Cactus Hill, where the faint outlines of pre-Clovis tools push back the clock and remind us that the story of first arrival is not a single tale, but 1,000 overlapping ones. Each site, each stone, each footprint, they are not fragments of a lost civilization, they are fragments of us. And they reveal something quietly profound. that to survive in the Pleistocene Americas was to live in relationship with the unknown, to accept change as constant, to let go of certainty. These people didn't build with permanence because they didn't need to. They carried their knowledge in their hands, their stories in their voices, and their belonging in motion. They lived as part of the land, not apart from it. What happens when a culture leaves no skyline, no roads, no graveyards carved in stone? You're left with the softest of records, a hearth darkened by ash, a pathway worn by repetition, a flake of obsidian struck precisely, left behind like punctuation in a sentence long forgotten. But in that softness lies resilience. These are lives that survived in some of the harshest climates imaginable, through glacial retreats, through megafaunal extinctions, through seasons that would buckle the knees of the unprepared, and they did so without fortresses, without fences, just fire, tools, memory, and movement. Perhaps then it is not their absence of architecture that should surprise us, but their refusal of it. A refusal not out of ignorance, but out of wisdom. A different answer to the question of how to belong to a place, an answer written in footprints. And so we return to the image that opened this chapter. A child, perhaps carried, perhaps walking. An adult pausing, stepping again. Their path crossing and overlapping over hours, maybe days. No flag planted, no stone engraved, just presence, just movement. And in that movement, in that dust, a civilization speaks. Not loudly, not forever, but enough. Enough to tell us that humans were here, and that their idea of home was not in what they left behind, but in how they moved through the world. To live without building does not mean to live without beauty, or skill, or care. It simply means the beauty was of a different kind, one meant to be felt, not photographed, one that faded gently into the earth, the way a footprint disappears in wind. But as the climate warmed and the ice began to retreat, something shifted in the rhythm of human life. It wasn't a sudden transformation, not a leap from tents to temples, but a gradual awakening of a new idea, that one could pause for longer, that a place could be returned to more deliberately, that a fire could outlast a single night. The earliest shelters, though still temporary, began to carry the quiet weight of intention. And so, long before the concept of a house as we understand it, humans began shaping the land into places of rest. In the great steppes of Eurasia, and across the mammoth kill sites of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have unearthed the bones of giants arranged into circles, the rib cages of woolly mammoths forming the frame of circular huts, their tusks used as archways, their skulls packed around for insulation. Over these ribbed skeletons of shelter, thick hides were stretched, weighted with stones. Inside, a hearth. Outside, wind. Within, a moment of warmth. Could such shelters have existed in early America? The evidence is faint, but the echoes are strong. In areas where mammoth hunting was practiced, such as the Great Plains, we find similar arrangements of bones clustered with charcoal and flint. Though no complete dwelling has survived, we can imagine them by analogy. A frame of bones, a skin of hide, a soul of fire. These were not accidental piles. They were architecture without architects, guided not by blueprint but by memory passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, and where mammoth bone was scarce there was brush, driftwood, earth itself. In forested regions, saplings could be bent into domes lashed with sinew, covered in grass or woven mats. These brush shelters, light, fast and temporary, could be raised in a day and left behind without regret. A ring of stones marked the fire marked the centre, and the centre, even in its impermanence, was sacred. What transforms a shelter into a home? It is not the thickness of walls, it is not the number of days stayed, it is the moment the space becomes something more than protection, when it becomes a place of return, of story, of ritual. The first shelters were not only places to sleep, they were places to cook, to laugh, to remember. Even if only for one night, they held the shape of belonging, and once that shape was known, it could be carried, repeated, refined, not on paper, but in the hands and instincts of those who moved. So when we ask what the first homes looked like, perhaps we should ask instead, what did they feel like? What did it mean to make a circle in the wild and call it enough? It meant choosing a spot not only for its safety, but for its story. A clearing, Near water, shaded by trees or sheltered by boulders, wasn't just practical. It was intuitive, emotional, ancestral. In that chosen space, humans began the earliest negotiations between body and landscape, crafting environments that were neither caves nor cities but something in between, soft thresholds between the self and the world. These first shelters were not declarations of territory, but invitations to pause. And in the world of hunter-gatherers, pausing was profound. Their lifeways were defined by movement, not aimless wandering, but patterned, thoughtful cycles, chasing migrations, harvesting ripening plants, following the turning of the seasons like a cosmic metronome. Home for them was not a fixed point. It was a series of remembered places, each one tied to a time of year, a resource, a ritual. How do you define home when it's always changing? For mobile societies, home was less about walls and more about rhythms. It was where the fire had been lit before, where the bones of ancestors had once been buried, where the shape of the stars overhead felt familiar. These people carried their sense of place in their minds, in their stories, in their steps. They moved not to escape, but to remain in sync with the land's offerings. Berries in the spring, fish in the summer, roots in the fall, furred game in the winter. Each return was a renewal, each stay a reenactment of memory, and so the shelters themselves adapted. They were never intended to last longer than the people needed them, but within their fleeting forms was a profound continuity. When a dome of bent wood and hide was raised where one had stood the year before, it became more than temporary, it became traditional. It became part of a seasonal choreography passed through generations, a dance between absence and return. What endures when nothing is built to last? Ideas, patterns, ways of knowing. The first shelters were as much about knowledge as they were about material. Knowledge of how to choose a site, how to read the slope of land to avoid pooling rain, how to align the doorway away from prevailing winds, how to store embers for the next fire. These weren't written down, but they were shared. Through repetition, through observation, through participation. A child watching a shelter be built was not a spectator. They were an apprentice in a lineage older than names. And at the heart of these homes was more than heat. There was fire, yes, but also conversation, stillness, the rituals of feeding and resting. The boundary between shelter and world was thin but meaningful. A wall of hide could become a wall of story. A ring of stones could be a perimeter not of ownership but of presence. And so, even when the materials blew away in the wind, something else remained. The idea that a home was not only a structure, but a moment of return in a world always moving. And at the very centre of that return, glowing against the cold breath of night, was fire. Not merely for warmth, not only for cooking, fire was the original anchor, the gravitational pull around which human life orbited. In every early shelter, no matter how crude or impermanent, there was almost always a hearth, a place not just to survive, but to be. The fire was light in darkness, it was memory in motion. It created a shared centre, a place where faces gathered and shadows danced and language stretched itself into new forms. What happens when a people first gather around flame? They begin to tell, to listen, to reflect. Fire demanded pause. It created a space where danger was kept at bay, and yet where minds could wander. And this pause, this rare moment of stillness, is what transformed a shelter from a mere shield into a sanctum. Even if the walls were made of brush, even if the roof was a stretched skin that dripped in the rain, that central fire made it something sacred, something internal. From that flickering light emerged the first boundaries, not of exclusion, but of intention. A ring of stones marking where heat ended and cold began. A circle of bodies forming a shape of shared being. Children learned not to cross the edge of the hearth too carelessly. Adults knew where to place themselves to catch the warmth. Without ever writing rules, early humans were sketching the first blueprints of interiority. Is a wall always the beginning of a home? Or can it be the line drawn in the mind between what is safe and what is unknown? Boundaries in early shelters were porous, often invisible. A brush shelter had no door, only a flap of hide. A mammoth bone hut could be entered from multiple sides, But in the presence of fire, the sense of inside was always there. The warmth was a kind of architecture. The circle it cast was a kind of room, and around that room rituals formed. The feeding of embers, the sharpening of tools, the passing of stories. When people slept around the same fire, they became more than a band. They became a memory held in common. So many of these shelters, of course, are gone. They dissolved into the soil, decomposed into silence. But archaeologists still find the ghost of their fire, a pocket of charcoal here, a basin of blackened earth there. Even when the bones and wood have vanished, the hearth remains. A fingerprint of dwelling, burned into time, and when we find them, we're finding more than heat. We're finding boundaries of belonging. We're finding the first blueprints not for buildings, but for being together, for marking out space in a vast, unclaimed world and saying, here we gather, here we rest, here, even if only for tonight, we are home. This quiet declaration, made not with words, but with action, shaped the emotional architecture of early human life. In these humble spaces, whether framed with bones or bent wood, something new was beginning to emerge. The sense that a shelter could be more than protection. It could be a vessel for meaning, a mirror for memory, a cradle not only for the body, but for thought. How do you craft meaning out of impermanence? The answer lies in repetition. These early shelters were not built once and abandoned. They were returned to, rebuilt, remade, in form if not in substance. Each time a structure was raised on familiar soil, it did not erase the last one. It layered upon it, like sediment of experience. A brush shelter constructed in a clearing where someone's grandmother once built her own might contain no surviving material, but it carried her knowledge, her choices, her story. The architecture of hunter-gatherers was made of memory more than of matter. And with that memory came ritual. A hearth lit at night wasn't just for cooking, it was a stage. Around its edge, hands moved in the shadows as carving tools, preparing food, comforting children. Words floated into the firelight. Songs, instructions, myths, laughter, regret. The fire was the first altar, the shelter, the first sanctuary, and within this sacred space humanity's oldest rituals unfolded, not with grandeur but with quiet constancy. Do we know what these early rituals were? Not exactly, but we see hints in the placement of ochre near hearths, in animal bones arranged in deliberate ways, in small beads lost beneath packed earth. These were not purely practical lives. There was art, there was symbolism, there were gestures meant not just to survive but to remember, to express, to connect with what could not be seen. And if those gestures happened around the fire inside those fragile walls, then the shelter itself became part of the ritual, a container for sacred time. Even the way people slept held meaning. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups note that sleep was communal and fluid. People slept in clusters, often facing the fire. Conversations drifted in and out of wakefulness. Dreams were shared. Stories were told before sleep and picked up again at dawn. There was no strict boundary between night and day, only the rhythm of life, held gently inside the temporary shell of the shelter. And so we begin to see that even though these early homes were made to be taken down, they were never empty. They held worlds. Worlds of knowledge, worlds of feeling, worlds of ritual and reflection. What does it say about us that our first homes were circles of warmth in the wilderness? Perhaps that before we ever learned to build monuments, we learned to build meaning, and that, in the end, was the more enduring structure. One not made of stone, but of firelight, faces, and shared time. And when the wind blew those shelters down, when the hides were packed, the poles unlashed, the ash scattered, the embers buried, something invisible remained. An imprint not unlike the footprints in the dust, a spatial memory, a ritual echo, a way of knowing that here, once, there was warmth, there was safety. There was a gathering of human lives drawn together not by walls but by willingness. What does it mean to leave behind a shelter that disappears completely, yet still marks the mind? It means the idea of home was not tethered to ownership or permanence, but to experience, to presence. The shelter did not need to endure, because the knowledge of how to make it, and why it mattered, endured instead. And that knowledge was the true inheritance, not buildings but practices, not materials but meanings. Archaeologists have uncovered only fragments of these earlier structures scattered like autumn leaves across the past. Burnt earth, post holes, bone circles, the blackened ghosts of hearths. No walls remain, no roofs. But in the pattern of absence we read a pattern of presence. These were people who knew when to stay and when to move, when to build and when to leave, and in that balance they found a kind of freedom modern life rarely allows. Could it be that in giving up permanence they gained intimacy? To sleep beneath a thin shelter with the sky still audible, to wake with the dawn bleeding through a hide flap, to listen to the wind breathing against the curve of brush. These are not vulnerabilities, they are connections. The first shelters were never meant to shut out the world. They were meant to hold just enough space for humans to be human and for the land to remain part of the conversation. Even now, echoes of these traditions survive. In the teepees of the plains, the domed wigwams of the northeast, the mat-covered tule houses of the west coast. Though centuries removed, though shaped by different needs and technologies, they whisper back to those first domes of mammoth rib and stretched hide. They carry the same essence, structure without severance, boundaries that breathe, and at the core of all these homes, then and now, is something ancient and indivisible, gathering. The act of coming together, of forming a circle, of holding warmth in the middle of the cold. That gathering, more than any wall, is what made the first shelters sacred. So when we ask what a home is, in the context of 15,000 years ago, we must resist the urge to look for bricks or beams. Instead, we look for signs of return, of fire, of ritual, of memory, a dark stain in the soil, a ring of discarded seeds, a slope where poles once leaned. These are the architectural signatures of people who lived not to possess the land but to belong to it. And perhaps, in that belonging, they built something more lasting than stone, a way of being at home, even when the world is moving. But if these early homes left no blueprints behind, no carved symbols, no tablets of instruction, how were they built at all? In the absence of writing, how did people remember which tree bends without snapping, which slope drains without flooding, which hide stretches tightest in the wind? How does a shelter rise from the land without plans, yet still stand against storm and season? What is knowledge when it is held in the body instead of the page? The earliest shelters in the Americas, like those across the ice-bridged worlds of Siberia and beyond, were not random heaps of material. They were designed, just not in the way we imagine design. No paper, no ruler, no angles drawn with charcoal on animal skin. Instead, there was attention. Deep, continuous attention to the rhythms of place, to the behaviour of snow, to the arc of the sun. In this kind of world, architecture was not imposed on the landscape, it emerged from it. This is intuitive architecture, a design language not taught in lecture halls, but in watching how shadows shift across midday stone. The people who built these first homes were not architects in the modern sense, but they were engineers of instinct. They understood that the slope of a shelter roof must mirror the incline of falling snow, that the tightness of a woven mat must respond to the pressure of rain, that smoke must be invited upward, not trapped inside. What does it mean to design with no external record? It means every act of construction was also an act of memory. To build was to recall. To recall was to belong. This was not improvisation, though it may appear that way through our modern lens. This was tradition made tangible, a structure not only shaped by the land, but by the countless shelters raised before. And though none survive intact, their shapes can still be traced in the choices made by descendants, the way a dome leans into wind, the way an entrance faces the morning sun, the way insulation is packed beneath bark or snow or thatch. Such choices are not arbitrary, they are whispered through generations. And the land too became a kind of mentor. Those who lived closely with it knew where the ground would flood in spring, where snow would drift deepest, where wind would shear a roof to tatters. They did not build in defiance of nature, but in conversation with it. Every shelter was a response, to climate, to need, to time. So when we walk through these ancient sites and see only empty soil, we are not witnessing a lack of intelligence. We are witnessing intelligence embodied, architecture without ink, blueprints drawn in footsteps, designs not to be looked at but lived within, and passed on not in documents but in doing. This is where the story deepens, because a world without writing is not a world without memory. Far from it. In fact, When no marks are made on clay or paper, the human mind becomes the archive. Knowledge becomes portable, skills become embodied, stories become maps, and the building of a shelter, something we think of today as a technical task, becomes a vessel of identity, of lineage, of inherited understanding. How does a child learn the art of building when there are no blueprints? By watching, by listening, by touching. In the earliest shelters, every movement was a lesson. The bending of a sapling showed how much force wood can take before it fibres apart. The stretching of hide revealed the limits of tension. The placing of stones around a hearth taught geometry long before geometry had a name. Children grew up surrounded by the choreography of making, not as spectators, but as future participants. And within this choreography, memory flowed like water. In hunter-gatherer societies, knowledge was never centralized. It moved through families, through kin networks, through small circles gathered around fires. An elder showing a teenager where to dig for sturdy willow roots. A mother teaching a daughter how to tie sinew so that it tightens in the cold. A father demonstrating the angle at which a snow block must be carved so that it locks into place for an igloo-like shelter. Nothing written, everything witnessed. Can knowledge survive without a medium other than the human mind? It did. It survived for tens of thousands of years, unbroken because it was lived. Memory is strongest when it is enacted, when it is tied to place, when it becomes not just information, but identity. Oral cultures do not store knowledge, they rehearse it, and each rehearsal adds nuance, refinement, precision. The result is not a simplistic tradition, but an evolving engineering wisdom carried forward one life at a time. This is social memory at its most powerful, an inheritance that does not sit on shelves, but walks on human legs. And it had another advantage, adaptability. When a tool broke, people learned why. When a storm tore down a shelter, they learned from the failure. When an animal hide lasted longer in one region but not another, they adjusted. Oral knowledge allows for flexibility because it is not rigidly codified. It changes with conditions, responding to environment, climate, and need. Isn't that, in its own way, a form of engineering more responsive than anything written? Imagine a world where every scrap of knowledge must earn its keep in the wild, where a poorly taught skill can mean death, where a remembered detail can save an entire band in a winter storm. In such a world, memory is not an accessory. It is survival itself. And building a shelter is not just construction. It is an act of continuity, a bridge between generations, a testament to those who came before. In this way, the first Americans built not only with materials, but with memory. A memory that shaped the land and was shaped by it in return. And shaping the land meant shaping with the land, not against it. In the absence of steel and concrete, early human builders turned not to invention, but to recognition. They looked not for what could be imposed on a place, but for what a place was offering. This was the third partner in their unspoken contract, the materials themselves: bone, hide, wood, snow. Each one chosen not because it was ideal everywhere, but because it was perfect somewhere. What does it mean to build with what the earth gives you? It means beginning with humility. If you are in the tundra, trees are not an option, but snow is. You learn how to carve it, to stack it, to seal it with body heat and time. The igloo is not an accident of necessity. It is a masterpiece of thermal engineering. Its curved shape minimizes wind resistance. Its interior traps warmth. Its very walls breathe. No nails, no metal. Just snow, packed with skill and trust in the material. In grasslands and forests, where wood was plentiful, entirely different techniques emerged. Saplings could be bent into strong arches. Bark could be peeled and layered. Longhouses in later eras began with these same fundamental insights. But even in the earliest versions, the pre-agricultural brush dwellings and hide domes, the builders knew how to coax a structure from wood without splitting it. They understood the grain, the tension, the memory of the tree itself, and where forests thinned and plains stretched toward the horizon, it was the animals who offered shelter. Bones became frames, hides became skin. In mammoth country, the ribs of giants curved into domes, while in bison country, hides stretched over tripod poles gave rise to teepee-like ancestors. These shelters were not crude improvisations. They were structural solutions developed over hundreds, maybe thousands of years of observation, trial, failure, and refinement. What happens when you don't see materials as separate from life? You begin to build in a way that is also a form of listening. You don't cut the tree without knowing when it last flowered. You don't gather snow without understanding how it packs and melts. You don't waste hide because it is not just material, it is memory, sacrifice, kinship. Every resource used was part of a wider web of relationship, and this relational building led to structures that were not just efficient, but reverent. Is that a kind of engineering we've forgotten? Modern architecture often begins with abstraction, a plan drawn in isolation then imposed on land. But early humans began with the land, and the plan emerged from within it. No line could be drawn without first knowing the slope of the ground, the pattern of the wind, the shape of what was already there. Their intelligence did not need diagrams. It lived in their hands, in the rhythm of seasons, in the quiet agreement between earth and mind. And that agreement is still buried beneath the soil, waiting to be read, waiting to be remembered, waiting to remind us that wisdom does not always come in lines. Sometimes it comes in circles, in curves, in the softness of snow shaped by human hands, and is that softness something profound was being drawn, not only a shelter, but a world-view. These early dwellings, however temporary, reflected a deep philosophy, that a structure is not just where you live, but how you live. To build was to participate in an ongoing relationship, not just with materials, but with memory, community, and place. The design was not an individual act, but a communal inheritance. You did not invent your shelter, you remembered it, remade it, and passed it on. What happens when the memory of building is shared, not stored? You get architecture without ego. A home built not to be admired, but to be inhabited. A structure that is shaped as much by conversation as by craft. In this world, every shelter was a dialogue, between elders and children, between material and need, between past and present. Each new dome of bent wood or bone carried echoes of others, shaped long before. A different kind of legacy, one not etched in stone but sung in stories, layered in gestures, held in hands. These stories, spoken aloud around fires and passed between generations, carried more than technique. They held the rhythms of the seasons, the meanings of places, the cautionary tales of collapsed roofs and flooded thresholds. And in them, the very act of building became ritual, not solemn, but sacred in its familiarity. Repeating what your ancestors did not because you couldn't imagine something new, but because the old ways had survived the test of time and frost and rain. Is it possible that the shape of a home contains the shape of a culture? The curve of a roof may tell us how wind behaves in a valley. The angle of a doorway might reveal the path of the sun in midwinter, but more than that, it reveals the priorities of the people within. Some shelters were meant to last only a few days. Fast to build, easy to leave. Others were seasonal, built strong enough to endure but always ready to return to the earth. In every case, the design reflected values: mobility, adaptability, balance. Balance especially, between effort and reward, between taking and giving, between being protected and being connected. Because the more a shelter cut you off from the world, the more it had to carry on its own. The first Americans didn't want to be cut off. They needed to hear the wind, smell the river, feel the cold shift that meant weather was changing. Their shelters filtered the world, not erased it. Thin walls that breathed, roofs that could be lifted, structures that knew how to disappear without leaving ruin. And what kind of intelligence does it take to make something that works, then vanishes? It's a question we rarely ask. We admire permanence. We measure greatness in stone. But these early builders had no interest in monuments. Their interest was survival, continuity, elegance in motion. And in that pursuit they created something just as noble, a design language written in silence, spoken in gesture, remembered, through doing. A language where nothing was wasted. Not wood, not snow, not memory, not time. And it is this language, quiet, tactile, ancestral, that still echoes in the archaeological shadows we study today. Though the shelters themselves have vanished, their wisdom lingers in the alignments of post holes, in the curves of collapsed hearths, in the grain of tool-worn stone. They left no blueprints, and yet the fingerprints of their design are everywhere, in every region, across climates vast and varied. People knew how to make the earth livable, not by overpowering it, but by learning from it. Isn't that the essence of true design? To listen first, and only then begin. The builders without blueprints did not need permanent structures to leave permanent impressions. Their architecture was iterative, relational, alive. It changed with each season. It flexed with each new lesson. It evolved with the needs of children born into colder winters, with the absences left by those who did not return. A wall was never just a barrier. It was a teaching. A roof was never only shelter. It was a signal, a guidepost to what mattered in that place, in that time. And what mattered most, it seems, was not how long a home could last, but how well it could hold life while it was needed. To build in this way was to accept impermanence not as a flaw, but as a feature. You built with the full knowledge that your work would disappear, and that did not lessen its value. It deepened it. These were structures designed to decay. Their end was not failure, but fulfillment. A brush shelter returning to soil was not a ruin, it was a return. And so, in building, these ancient people taught us something we are only now beginning to remember, that architecture, like life, is at its best when it belongs fully to its moment and does not pretend to last beyond its purpose. Can we imagine designing today with that kind of humility? They used what they had: bone, hide, wood, snow, materials that carried memory, that resisted uniformity, that required touch and care and skill to understand. They knew which wood to cut in spring, which bone to leave untouched. They learned how to join things not with nails or screws, but with sinew and tension and time. They wove weather into their walls, they shaped air. They welcomed heat and directed it with curved surfaces and smoke holes. They made homes that held space without holding too tightly. And so, across millennia, they left behind not buildings, but instructions. Not in words, but in form, in pattern, in how the land itself remembers the presence of people who moved gently through it. We will never find their blueprints. We will never uncover scrolls of design or diagrams of roof angles. But if we look closely, if we listen the way they listened, we will see their legacy in the way stones lie beside ancient fire pits, in the bend of saplings where no trees now grow, in the blackened soil where once there was heat. And perhaps that is the final gift of these early builders, not their structures, but their mindset. A way of creating that begins not with dominion, but with respect. A way of living that makes room for disappearance. A way of remembering that doesn't need writing, because it is already written in the bones of the earth. There are places in the world where permanence feels like a kind of arrogance, where the wind, wide and wild, sculpts the land more than any hand could ever hope to. The Great Plains is one such place. Here, beneath the sweeping sky, home was never a matter of walls and anchors. It was a negotiation with motion, a choreography with the invisible, an act of learning to vanish and return again with grace. What does it mean to build a dwelling in a world that does not stay still? On these plains, grasses move like water and clouds pass like herds. To survive here, one had to read patterns that shifted not by decade, but by afternoon. The wind arrived not as visitor, but as host, sometimes whispering, sometimes roaring. No stone held it back. No tree line softened its advance. The early peoples of the plains didn't resist it. They listened. They adapted. They folded the wisdom of movement into their homes. Long before the iconic tipi as we imagine it emerged, there were other structures. Humble in material, brilliant in intent. Tripod frames of slender poles draped with hide or bark or woven grass mats. Homes that could be raised in a breath, taken down in a heartbeat, carried across leagues of sun-bleached prairie. These were the ancestors of the mobile shelters we now associate with later plains cultures, but their roots lie deeper, in a time when every decision was made in response to terrain and sky. Why insist on heaviness in a land made of air? To live well here, to survive and to thrive, was to build like the wind itself, with tension and grace, with balance and lightness. The early mobile shelters weren't just functional, they were elegant. They rotated their entrances away from the strongest gusts. They breathed through flaps and gaps that responded to shifting pressure. They stood like sculptures in the open, part of the landscape, never above it. And in their bones, those poles, those bindings, was a logic as refined as any written plan. The poles were selected with care, straight, strong, flexible. carried long distances when needed, leaned together at precise angles to create strength through tension. No nails, no hinges, just knowledge, inherited and embodied. The skins or mats stretched across them were not random coverings. They were the memory of previous dwellings, cut and repaired and stretched again. Each shelter carried its own ancestry. What happens when a home is no longer a place, but a rhythm? These early structures taught a different kind of architecture, one not of possession but of presence, not of territory but of trail. They arose where food was found, where water ran, where the herd had passed, and when the time came they vanished, not in ruin but in readiness. A home here was not lost, it was simply waiting to be built again, recalled from memory, reconstructed from the breath of the plains themselves. To understand the brilliance of these mobile dwellings, we must step fully into the logic of the Great Plains, a logic written not in stone or wood but in cycles. Here, seasons were not gentle shifts, they were transformations. Summer delivered heat that shimmered against the earth like a mirage. Winter arrived as a force, carving drifts taller than a person, dragging temperatures down into the bone. Spring was violent with storms. Autumn whispered only briefly before the world turned again. How do you build a home when the year itself is always changing shape? You build for movement. You build for transition. You build for the knowledge that no season should find you unprepared. The early peoples of the plains knew the migratory patterns of bison, long before they built structures around them. They knew when herds would thunder north and when they would drift back south. They understood the timing of grasses, the melting of river ice, the brief but nourishing ripeness of prairie fruits. Their dwellings were not static interruptions of this rhythm. They were part of it. They rose where the world allowed, and they fell when the land asked them to move on. This was not weakness. It was ecological fluency. The temporary shelters that preceded the teepee were adapted from the same principle. Let the land decide where you stand. In winter, when wind carved the plains into hard ridges, shelters were tucked behind bluffs or nestled beside riverbanks, their hides tightened against the cold. In summer, when heat rippled across vast expanses of grassland, shelters opened themselves to breezes, transforming from enclosed spaces into airy sanctums of shade. A single home could breathe. It could inhale cool air and exhale smoke. It could shift its weight, loosen its bindings, adjust its posture just as a living body might. Is a home still a home if it knows how to disappear? The people of the plains would say yes, because disappearance was part of survival. A permanent structure on the open prairie was a liability. It fought a war against wind it could never win. But a lightweight structure, designed to be taken down in minutes, carried no such conflict. Its very impermanence was its strength. If storms pressed in, the dwelling could be lowered. If the herds moved, the dwelling could follow. If danger approached, nothing held people in place. Mobility was safety. Mobility was prosperity. And out of this necessity grew an unexpected beauty, a way of building that required elegance instead of excess. Each pole mattered. Each hide had a known place. Each knot was tied not just to hold, but to release when needed. There was no decoration for decoration's sake, yet in their simplicity these structures possessed a quiet grace that rivaled any later architecture. What does it reveal about a people when their most cherished homes leave so little behind? Only this, that a dwelling can be both fragile and perfect, that architecture does not need permanence to have meaning, that a home shaped by wind, grass and migratory time is less intentional, only lighter, more adaptive, more awake to the land that sustains it. And so the plains taught a lesson that is easy to forget in a world obsessed with longevity, that beauty is not always found in what endures, but often in what responds. These ancient homes did not measure their success in centuries, but in seasons, or even days. They were built to answer a question the land kept asking: where are you now, and what do you need to live? These weren't just shelters. They were instruments of survival, tuned to the rhythms of the earth. That rhythm was dictated by cycles both immense and intimate. The environmental constraints of the plains were not optional. They were everything. The people who lived here moved not only because the herds did, but because water did, because fire did, because the wind carried seeds and threats and blessings alike. A sudden hailstorm could flatten a camp. A wildfire could erase a region. A dry spring could turn rivers into dusty veins. But these weren't surprises to those who watched closely. They were expected, prepared for, built into the very fabric of how people lived. To remain still in this place was to risk ruin. The migratory structures reflected this. They were not makeshift in the way we sometimes imagine. They were meticulous, portable but durable, designed not to fight the weather but to let it pass through. Their materials were chosen with knowledge, hides that tightened in the cold to insulate better or loosened in heat to allow breath, poles that flexed with wind but rarely snapped, openings that faced the right way depending on season and storm. This was architecture with no margin for error and no tolerance for waste. And there was a kind of poetry in this pragmatism. When winter came and the land grew still and sharp, people shifted their camps into windbreaks and valleys. Some dug shallow pits to drop the base of their shelters below the wind line. Others added layers, grass mats, woven bark, extra hides, insulation from a cold that showed no mercy. Then, come spring, these additions were peeled away like memory. The structure breathed again, moved again, laughed again in the wind. What does it mean to treat a home like a living thing? It means acknowledging that your shelter is not separate from your world. It is your world, shaped into form. And that world, especially here on the plains, was one of movement, of fire, of grass that fed not just animals, but the rhythm of life itself. You could not build without knowing the seasons intimately, without reading the shape of clouds, without smelling snow days before it fell. The architecture was not in blueprints, it was in the senses, and because of this, every shelter was unique, not in its structure but in its moment. Built for that day, in that wind beside that stream, a poem in hide and pole written to vanish when the wind turned, and yet, for all their impermanence, these structures held something that permanent buildings often lack: elegance. Not the elegance of decoration or ornament, but the elegance of restraint, of knowing exactly how much is enough. The homes of the plains were engineered through generations of iteration to do precisely what was needed and no more. Light enough to carry, strong enough to hold, open enough to breathe, closed enough to warm. They were the distillation of necessity into form. What happens when a dwelling becomes a philosophy? Then even the act of pitching camp becomes a ritual, not mindless repetition, but practiced fluency. Setting the poles, tying the cords, stretching the hide. Each step was learned through demonstration, through participation, through memory. Children grew up in the rhythm of construction. By the time they could walk, they could help. By the time they could speak, they knew which pole came first. A home wasn't just built. It was remembered, rehearsed, lived into. And the structure itself reflected that choreography. The earlier forms of the teepee or conical hide tent were often built with a tripod of long poles, with others added to form a circular frame. This frame was not random. It relied on precise weight distribution. The entire structure leaned into tension, gravity balanced by rope, friction, and muscle memory. It was secure not because it resisted movement, but because it danced with it. When wind pushed, it bent. When rain fell, it shed. When snow came, it compacted gently under the weight, refusing to collapse. This was architecture without anchors, and yet it was deeply grounded. There is a paradox here, that the most stable structures on the plains were the ones easiest to take down, and that paradox reflects the lives of the people themselves. In a land where the horizon was always moving, and survival depended on following that movement, homes could not be prisons. They had to be wings. They had to fold and unfold. They had to allow life to pass through without holding it back. And in this way, they mirrored something far more profound. Because to build a dwelling that vanishes is also to build a life that does not demand permanence to have meaning. In the Western imagination, home is often tied to ownership, to stillness, to rootedness. But in the plains cultures, home was not a fixed point. It was an experience. A place could be returned to, but it did not have to be held. A camp might last days, weeks, or a season. It might be rebuilt the following year, or never again. That did not diminish its importance. It only made the moment matter more. To live lightly does not mean to live carelessly. It means you know what to carry. And those who moved with the wind carried more than poles and hides. They carried knowledge of sky, of animal, of water, of time. Their dwellings were not containers of possessions, but expressions of understanding, sculptures of necessity, built to vanish, but never forgotten, and perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of these wind-borne homes, not their physical remnants, which the earth has long reclaimed, but the quiet intelligence they left behind, an intelligence embedded in motion, in restraint, in listening. A teepee, or its earlier cousins, may disappear with the season, but the knowledge of how to build it does not. It passes from one generation to the next, not in books or blueprints, but in hands, in doing, in watching the way a pole leans or a hide flexes. These were not primitive shelters. They were precise answers to complex problems, how to live well and lightly in a place that punishes heaviness. There is a profound humility in the architecture of the Great Plains. It does not demand to be seen. It does not compete with the sky. It folds itself into the curve of the land, or stands just tall enough to meet the horizon's eye. And when the moment comes to leave, it lets go. No ruin, no debris, only flattened grass, smoke-scented earth, and the knowledge that it had served its purpose. And is that not, in some way, a form of sacredness? To make something so well that it leaves no scar, to live in such a way that even the wind approves. This is not nostalgia for a lost world. It is a recognition that architecture, real architecture, does not require permanence. It requires attention. It requires understanding of place, of cycle, of what is needed and what is not. The dwellings of the plains were never fixed in stone, and yet their principles endure. Build with what you can carry. Design with what the world gives you. Let your home change shape as the world does, and in doing so, you become part of the wind, not a victim of it. As modern humans, it's easy to mistake architecture for buildings, for concrete and grids and zoning laws. But our species learned how to live long before we learned how to draw plans. The early people of the Americas, and especially those who made their lives on the moving sea of prairie, show us that home is not a structure. It is a way of being, a way of moving through the world with intention, with respect, and with readiness to leave no harm behind. Their shelters vanished not because they were weak, but because they were wise. And now, centuries later, if we look back across the wind-swept past, we can still see their wisdom. Not in the monuments they left behind, but in the absence they left well. In the knowledge that sometimes the best kind of dwelling is one that listens more than it speaks. One that disappears without taking too much with it. And one that, like a whisper in the grass, will always return when the time is right. When the winds finally stilled and the hunger for motion quieted, something ancient within the human spirit whispered a question older than language itself. What if we stayed? What if we let the seasons pass around us while we remained still, folded into the earth like seed and stone? In the shadow of mountains and along rivers born of glacial breath, people began to dig, not for treasure, but for warmth, for stability, for shelter that did not run with the herds, but waited for their return. Across what is now the American West and into the northern plateaus, our ancestors began to build downward, not skyward, carving hollows into the land itself. These were pit houses, sunken structures part home, part hearth, part echo chamber of the earth's own rhythms. They were neither caves nor cabins, but something between, a space that remembered the cold above and insulated life below. What compels a people to root themselves into the ground? Perhaps it was the promise of return, of gathering, of memory. Perhaps it was necessity, the growing realization that in certain places at certain times the world was generous enough to allow pause. Food sources grew more predictable. Water, though scarce in places, flowed with enough consistency. And so the people, still hunters, still foragers, began to draw circles not only in the dust of a single season, but in the continuity of years. And at the heart of those circles were homes dug into the soil. Pit houses were more than holes. They were decisions made with reverence. Typically between 1 and 4 feet deep, their floors were smoothed and sometimes lined with bark, with woven mat, with stone. Roofs were constructed with wooden beams laid across the circular or oval span, then layered with brush, hide, and finally earth. A breathing skin held aloft by intention and balance. An opening at the top served as both a smoke vent and a metaphor, letting light pierce the dark, letting night stars pour down like embers. Some even had central fire pits, not just for heat or food, but for continuity. To place fire at the centre was not just practical, it was symbolic. What does it mean to build warmth into the bones of the land? These homes were cool in summer and warm in winter, protected from wind, buffered from snow, shaded from sun. The earth became insulation, regulator, shield. And in choosing to live beneath the surface, the early inhabitants of the Americas made their first great architectural alliance, not with timber or stone, but with the thermal logic of the land itself. They listened to heat, they listened to shadow. They built not by resisting nature, but by cooperating with it. This was not science, as we frame it today. But it was something perhaps more powerful. Deep observation, repeated across generations until it became indistinguishable from instinct. A shelter built into the ground was not a sign of primitiveness. It was a declaration of understanding, a quiet contract with the soil to keep each other alive. But the people did not stop with the earth alone. As they shaped their dwellings below, they began to look above, to the sky, to the path of the sun, to the rhythm of light as it travelled across the year. And with the same careful patience they had once used to watch the movement of animals, they watched the movement of shadows, sunrise in winter, sunset in summer, the changing angles of warmth and light. It became clear, to live well was not only to live with the earth, but also with the sun. Some of the pit houses, especially those found across the Colorado Plateau, the Columbia Basin, and parts of the Southwest, began to orient their entrances with intent. Openings faced east to greet the rising light, or south to gather the low winter sun. In some places, archaeologists believed dwellings were aligned to catch the sun at solstice or equinox, inviting not only heat, but meaning. This was passive solar design long before the term existed. Roofs were sloped or shaped in such a way that light poured in during the cold months and retreated when heat became oppressive. Inward-facing walls absorbed warmth and radiated it back slowly. Fire pits and smoke holes doubled as ventilation systems, allowing air to circulate naturally. There were no thermostats. There was only attention paid to wind direction, to the length of shadow, to the thermal mass of stone and soil. The dwellings became instruments that played the weather, and the people, in turn, became musicians of space and season. They learned how to adjust coverings to block or welcome light. They knew when to seal a shelter tightly and when to let it breathe. They stored food in the coolest corners where sun never reached. They slept closer to fire in winter and nearer to the shaded perimeter in summer. There was no electricity, no mechanical advantage, only the gift of placement, the wisdom to know that where a home sits is as important as how it is built. It's easy to miss this kind of brilliance. We often imagine technological advancement as towers and wires and the hum of machines, but the people who shaped homes with the arc of the sun were practicing a form of knowledge just as intricate. They measured not with rulers, but with shadow. They calculated not in degrees, but in experience. And their reward was not only comfort, it was longevity. A well-built pit house, correctly aligned, could be returned to year after year, each time offering the same gentle shelter, the same silent affirmation. Yes, you belong here. And what is architecture if not that? Not walls, not roofs, but a way of saying, quietly, consistently, that life is welcome in this place. And so, the people built, not just for the body but for the rhythm of the world itself, not just shelter but harmony, not just survival but grace. And with grace came meaning, not just functional but symbolic. A dwelling, once shaped by soil and sunlight, began to echo something deeper, cosmology. For these were not merely places to eat and sleep, they were miniature worlds, microcosms of belief laid out in dirt and timber. To step into a pit house was to step into a story, one etched not in ink, but in alignment, direction, and design. For many early peoples of the Americas, the world was not random. It was ordered, sacred, and directional. The cardinal points, north, south, east, west, were not abstract compass readings. They were spiritual forces. They mark not just geography but relationships between the self, the ancestors, and the living land. So when a doorway faced east, it did so with intention, to greet the dawn, to let in new life, to honour the beginnings of things. The rising sun was more than warmth. It was renewal. The western wall might be where darkness came, where the spirit travelled at death, where closure resided. The fire pit at the centre of the home wasn't just a heat source, it was the heart of the world, the axis mundi, the line between underworld and sky. Homes were built in circles, not just for structural stability, but to reflect the sacred hoop, a symbol common across many indigenous cosmologies. A circle had no beginning, no end. It was the shape of breath, of seasons, of time itself. Even the act of entering was symbolic. In many traditions, to enter a dwelling was to reenact creation, descending through a ladder into the earth womb, then emerging again into the world of light. The smoke hole in the ceiling became more than ventilation. It was a connection to the heavens. Stars could be seen through it. Prayers could rise with the smoke. It was a channel between the human and the divine. Nothing in these homes was arbitrary. The placement of sleeping areas, the position of storage pits, even the shape of support beams, all carried echoes of belief, of ancestry, of unseen forces. These were not buildings that separated people from nature. They were invitations to participate in it, to live within the great order, not above it. And in this we see a different kind of architecture. One not of ego, but of relationship. Not a monument to human will, but a shelter of humility. A home not just for the body, but for the soul's orientation to the world. There is a beauty in this, not loud, not showy, but quiet and enduring. A beauty that whispers through clay floors and ash lines, through post holes and hearths long cold. A beauty that says, we were here and we listened. We watched the sky, we learned the land, and we built not only with our hands but with our hearts turned outward, toward the sun. This interweaving of survival, observation, and reverence formed a world view in which the home was not separate from the cosmos. It was a continuation of it. The pit house was not just a shelter, it was an axis, a meeting point between layers of existence. Its floors, dug deep into the living earth, touched the underworld. The place of ancestors, of origin, of dreaming. Its roof, reaching up to the smoke hole and sky, aligned with the stars, the sun, the unseen motions of time. And in the centre we find the fire, always the fire, always alive. In the low darkness of a semi-subterranean home, the fire became the world's bright heart, flickering, shifting, alive with story and memory. Children circled it, elders tended it. Food was cooked, songs were sung, wounds were warmed, and spirits were fed. But more than function, the fire offered a centre, not only spatially, but emotionally. In the pit house, all lines curved toward it. All words, all silences gathered near it. The architecture of these homes encouraged togetherness. Unlike later structures with divided rooms and segmented walls, these early dwellings were shared spaces. Family slept shoulder to shoulder. Knowledge passed not in solitude, but in circles. The layout of the home, open, sunken, centred, created an intimacy that mirrored the kinship of its builders. To be inside a pit house was to belong to a group, to a rhythm, to a history both personal and collective. Even storage was circular. Food caches were dug into the floors, protected from heat and scavengers. Carefully sealed pits held dried berries, roots, fish, or seeds. These were not just survival caches, they were acts of trust in the future. To store food underground was to believe there would be a season to return, a day when hunger would come again and be met with something already prepared. Shelters like these were often reused for generations. Excavations reveal overlapping pit houses, rebuilt again and again on the same site, like tree rings layered in clay and ash. The people did not simply move on and forget. They remembered. They returned. They honoured the places that had offered warmth and rest, digging once more into familiar soil, repeating the sacred act of shaping space into meaning. And while the structures themselves have long collapsed, roofs fallen in, beams turned to dust, their patterns remain. Circular stains in the ground, blackened patches of ancient fires, stones aligned in ways that still catch the solstice light. These echoes tell us something essential, that early architecture was not only engineering, but memory made visible. That these were not people without science, but people with another kind. A science of attention, of patience, of respect for cycles too vast to measure in years alone. They built with earth, yes, but also with time. And as these ancient builders shaped hollows into soil and lined doorways to meet the sun, they were doing something even deeper, weaving themselves into the landscape's memory. Every pit house was a story inscribed into the ground, a blending of human presence with geological patience. Walls might melt, roofs might collapse, but the impression, the deliberate shaping, remained long after the people moved on. What does it mean for a home to remember its makers? Even now, when archaeologists kneel over these sunken rings of packed earth, they can feel the continuity. The hearth in the centre tells them where warmth once radiated. The charcoal flecks whisper of dinners, of gatherings, of hands feeding fire. The post holes reveal the span of roof beams, the weight of the world the dwelling was asked to hold. The entrance alignment reveals where the morning light fell on winter solstice, where the builders wanted the year's return to shine first. The home becomes a message sent across centuries, addressed to whoever would one day discover its quiet geometry. These places blur the line between engineering and devotion. They show that architecture need not be monumental to be meaningful. A semi-subterranean home, humbly shaped and softly lit, could hold a cosmology, a world view, a people's understanding of themselves in relation to earth and sky. And in that layered understanding, a truth emerges, that the earliest homes in the Americas were not shelters against nature. They were agreements with it. The people who built them understood something fundamental. They knew the land was not static. They knew the sun's path was not random. They knew warmth could be borrowed, not forced. They knew the cycles of night and day, of season and shadow, were not obstacles, but partners. And so they built structures that echoed those rhythms, cool in summer, warm in winter, shaped by the land's own breath. This is why their dwellings endured not in form but in principle. Later cultures across the West would continue to build earth lodges, kivas, and semi-subterranean ceremonial spaces, all echoing the ancient intuition that the deepest wisdom lies beneath the surface. The people understood that to go downward was to approach the beginning. To root themselves in the earth was to be held by something older than any story they could tell. And perhaps this is why these homes feel so resonant to us now, in a world of noise and speed, where buildings scrape the sky and rooms multiply like mirrors. There is something profoundly human about stepping into a space shaped by soil and sunlight. Something grounding, something that reminds us that long before we raised walls to separate ourselves from the world, we shaped hollows to join ourselves to it. And maybe that is the quiet truth the earth still carries from those early shelters, that home is not where we build tallest, but where we build in alignment with something larger than ourselves. Before the plough, before the seed, before the slow geometry of tilled rows stretched across river valleys, and the deliberate order of farming reshaped the wild into the domestic, there were villages, not imagined, not dreamed, but real, thriving communities built by people who had never planted a single crop. Across the Pacific Northwest, along the mist-laced banks of the Columbia River and into the densely canopied southeast, groups of humans began to settle down. Not because they had to, but because the land offered enough to stay, enough to build. What must it have felt like to look out over a tide of salmon flashing upstream by the millions, knowing they would return every year as faithful as the moon? What must it have meant as to stand in a grove of cedar and know that the forest would clothe you, shelter you, heat your winters, and carve your canoes? This was not scarcity. This was surplus, born not from farming, but from a landscape that gave so freely it blurred the lines between movement and stillness. And so, long before domesticated grains tied other humans to the soil, people here chose to linger. They returned season after season to the same fishing grounds, the same clam-rich estuaries, the same groves where camas bulbs bloomed in blue waves beneath open sky. With time, their shelters grew more permanent. Storage pits deepened. Fires became fixtures, not interruptions. And then, at last, the village emerged, not as a break from wildness, but as an extension of its abundance. These were not tiny hamlets of struggle and drift. In places like the Pacific coast of British Columbia and the ancient shell-ring settlements of the American Southeast, populations swelled into the hundreds. They built with intention, with repetition, with memory that lived not in writing, but in wood and earth. At sites like Ditchley in Virginia, or the ancient ring middens of Sapelo Island in Georgia, archaeological evidence reveals people who had stopped wandering, not because they lacked options, but because they had mastered mobility and stillness in perfect balance. And here arises a beautiful contradiction. We are taught to believe that agriculture is the foundation of permanence, that villages arise from the logic of sowing and harvest, that without grain, we wandered. And yet, these early North American communities defy that story. They did not need fields to find home. They needed rivers and coasts and forests that sang with life. Their villages formed not in spite of their hunter-gatherer ways, but because those ways were rich enough to support community, identity and structure. What kind of architecture is born when people stay? Not because they must, but because they want to. What happens when stability is not enforced by crops, but invited by generosity of place? And how do you build a home in a world where the land feeds you, even as it asks for nothing in return? The answers begin where cedar trees meet shoreline, and firelight dances on woven walls. Because where people stayed, they began to build, not in haste, but in harmony. And what they built was not the solitary dome of a family shelter, but something communal, enduring, alive with voices. Across the Pacific Northwest, in lands blessed with rivers of salmon and forests of towering cedar, emerged one of the most iconic structures of pre-agricultural village life, the longhouse. Stretched like wooden rivers themselves, longhouses could reach over 100 feet in length and house dozens of people, multiple families, often extended kin, sharing space not only for sleep, but for stories, ceremonies, and survival. These weren't just shelters. They were architecture made of relationship. Rows of fire pits lined the centre, each anchoring a family hearth. Smoke drifted upward through carefully cut vents in the roof, while carved beams and woven mats marked the boundaries of each family's domain, porous boundaries, flexible and shared. Constructed primarily from red cedar, a tree both sacred and essential, the longhouse embodied a kind of engineering rooted in repetition and reverence. Split cedar planks, lashed to massive beams, formed the walls and roof. The structure could breathe, expanding in the wet, shrinking in the dry, adapting to the pulse of the seasons like a living organism. And because cedar resisted rot, these homes endured. They were repaired, inherited, extended, passed on like wisdom. But the true architecture of the longhouse was not in its beams or walls. It was in the way it gathered people. Inside, there was space for elders and children, for marriage feasts and mourning songs, for daily life and sacred rites. Here, knowledge passed through the warmth of repetition, how to carve, how to weave, how to track tides and read the language of ravens. The longhouse held memory just as surely as it held bodies. It was not a private space. It was a social core. To live within one was to live in relationship, to share fire, food, and responsibility. This form of communal architecture also appeared in different materials and styles throughout pre-agricultural settlements in the southeast. Though longhouses as such were less common there, archaeologists at places like Poverty Point in Louisiana and Sapien Island in Georgia have uncovered circular village patterns, shell rings, and earthworks that suggest similar social intentions: to gather, to stay, to return. Dwellings clustered around central areas for feasting, dancing, or ceremony. Even without agriculture, people lived with enough abundance to construct homes that welcomed repetition, homes that expected you back. And in both regions, we begin to see that architecture without agriculture is not a contradiction. It is a revelation. That home does not require harvest, that walls can rise from generosity, not scarcity. And that permanence, the urge to mark a place with care and intention, is not born from domestication of plants, but from the richness of relationship with place, with others, and with time itself. And what bound these early communities together, even more than shared ancestry or daily survival, was the rhythm of ritual. For it wasn't only food and shelter that kept people returning to these villages year after year. It was ceremony, it was feasting, it was the architecture of shared meaning. Along the coasts and river valleys, vast gatherings unfolded, sometimes seasonal, sometimes tied to astronomical cycles, tides, or animal migrations. These were more than practical events. They were sacred. People came not only to harvest the bounty of fish, shellfish, or roots, but to renew bonds, to sing, to give, to dance, to remember. The architecture that emerged in these contexts, open gathering spaces, circular plazas, earthworks, even the layout of homes, reflected a culture where community was not a side effect of living together, but a central purpose. At the Sapien shell ring complex in Georgia, circular arrangements of dwellings and refuse formed massive rings, some over 80 metres across. These were not haphazard piles. The ring shape likely held symbolic meaning, and recent studies suggest the rings were built intentionally, likely over generations, possibly even as acts of communal memory. In the centre of each ring, open space, a place to gather, to witness, to be seen. The garbage of daily life, shells, bones, broken tools, became the very walls of these rings. In this we glimpse something profound, that the remains of feasts were not discarded, but arranged. The village itself became a layered document, a living archive of celebration and sustenance. Shell by shell, a structure rose that was both physical and social. This blending of ritual and architecture was not limited to the southeast. In the Pacific Northwest, the longhouses themselves became stages for potlatches, large gift-giving feasts that reaffirmed social status, redistributed wealth, and renewed social contracts. During these gatherings, the architecture would change, curtains drawn, firelight dimmed, masks donned. Songs echoed between beams. The longhouse became a vessel for transformation, a ceremonial body, a bridge between the everyday and the eternal. Feasting here was not gluttony. It was generosity as power. To give away salmon or cedar boxes or blankets, to distribute wealth rather than hoard it, was to earn prestige, to confirm leadership. And these acts were made possible by the abundance of the land and the stability of the village. It was precisely because these people did not farm that their rituals could flourish. The land fed them, and so they fed one another. In this way, architecture was not simply about walls. It was about holding space for relationship, not just between humans and environment, but among humans themselves. Shelter became theatre. Hearth became altar. The village, in its design and use, was not a place to retreat from the world. It was the place where the world was made visible, together, repeatedly, with joy. And still, beneath the joy and rhythm of these communities, we find the presence of something quieter, something enduring, a deep sense of belonging that transcends material need. For these villages, built before farming, before hierarchy, before walls of stone, were not just experiments in cohabitation. They were long meditations on how to live with others, how to share space, how to remain distinct yet interwoven. This is perhaps most clearly seen in the architectural choices that privileged the collective over the individual. A longhouse was not built for one. It was not designed to assert privacy, but to nurture continuity. Within its shared walls, generations overlapped. Grandparents slept near newborns. Rituals and songs were not compartmentalized events, but daily occurrences in a space always humming with life. Architecture served less to separate and more to synchronize. It was a kind of social choreography. Fires placed at intervals, partitions created with fabric or mats, not to divide but to remind. Remind each person that they belonged. In the southeast too, shared architecture prevailed. Villages were often organized around central communal spaces, plazas or open grounds, ringed by dwellings whose very placement reinforced social cohesion. You did not simply live beside someone. You faced the same fire. You faced the same open space where stories were told, disputes resolved, spirits honoured. The design encouraged transparency, not seclusion. And yet this cohesion was not uniformity. Within these shared spaces, individuality thrived in expression, in carvings, in paint, in the decoration of tools or woven mats. Identity was not erased by togetherness. It was framed by it. Like unique threads in a basket, each strand found strength in the weave. The architecture did not flatten the self. It held it, supported it, made space for its presence among others. Storage structures also reflect this delicate balance. In many of these villages, food storage, for dried fish, nuts, or roots, was communal. Pits dug beneath longhouses or within shell rings held the bounty of collective labour. To store food together was to extend trust forward in time. It was a bet on cooperation, on mutual need, on a tomorrow shared. And because the land was generous, because no single person could carry away its fullness, this kind of shared abundance became a natural architecture of ethics, of belonging. The village, then, was not a product of agricultural necessity. It was a response to ecological invitation, and the buildings, the longhouses, the rings, the plazas, were not impositions on the land, but conversations with it. This is what makes these early settlements so moving. They offer a model of how humans can build permanence without dominance, structure without conquest, home not through control, but through relationship, through choosing again and again to stay together. And in that choice, these early villagers left behind something more durable than stone. They left behind a philosophy of living, a worldview inscribed not in monuments, but in the way a fire was placed, in the shape of a roof beam, in the alignment of homes around a clearing where voices gathered. They remind us that architecture need not rise to be remembered. Sometimes it sinks into the earth, or drifts with the smoke, or fades softly back into cedar and soil. When we study these villages now, their layered shell middens, their decaying post holes, their burned hearths, what we're really reading is the shape of human attention, not the dramatic kind that seeks conquest or control, but the kind that listens, that waits, that notices where the sun falls at dusk in winter, that watches the tides and learns when the salmon return, that knows when a root can be dug and when it must be left to flower for another year. This kind of attention, patient, relational, attuned, is what made pre-agricultural villages possible. Not every landscape invited it, but where it was possible, where land gave and people gave back, a profound stillness emerged, a kind of chosen settlement that held the best of the wandering world, its humility, its observation, its adaptability, and combined it with the grace of staying. So often we tell the story of villages as an invention of necessity, the byproduct of farming, the outcome of surplus that demanded storage, which in turn demanded walls, which demanded property, and so on. But here, in these early American settlements, we find something different. A village not of need, but of trust. A structure not imposed by hunger, but offered by abundance. These were people who could have kept moving, and often did seasonally, but who returned, who remembered, who built again, and perhaps most importantly, who did so without destroying the land that made it possible. Their homes did not scar the earth. Their rings were made of what they ate. Their fires ran on fallen wood. Their structures, when abandoned, returned to soil almost without trace, except in the gentle depressions, the softened mounds, the stories the ground still carries. There was no conquest in their dwelling, only conversation, only continuity. In a time when we measure progress by permanence, skyscrapers, roads, walls that endure centuries, these early villages offer a different wisdom. That impermanence is not fragility. That smallness is not insignificance. That choosing to live lightly does not mean living without meaning. It means instead choosing relationship over possession, choosing place over control, choosing again and again to face one another across the fire, and to build not because we must, but because it is beautiful to do so. And so, long before the first seed was planted in soil, these villagers planted something deeper, a way of being that asked not what we could take from the land, but what we might build beside it. They built not with stone nor steel, but with silence, soil, and the gentle weave of memory. Across the landscapes of prehistoric North America, far from temples and citadels, far from what we call civilization, rose structures made of mud, straw, sticks, and bone. They did not pierce the horizon. They did not gleam. They disappeared as easily as they appeared, dissolving back into the earth that had once embraced them. And yet, in that impermanence, they held a strange endurance, for these dwellings did more than shelter bodies. They housed stories. What does it mean to build a home from breath and earth? In the woodlands and river valleys, in marshes and grasslands, ancient hands shaped lattices of branch and reed, what archaeologists call wattle, and pressed them with daub, a thick earthen paste of mud, clay, grass, and animal dung. This was not primitive. This was precision, born of intuition and repetition. Packed in layers and smoothed by hand, these walls could withstand seasons of rain, wind, and time. They could bend with the frost and breathe with the sun. They were, quite literally, made of the same matter as the landscape, stitched together with knowledge, not mortar. But why choose such humble materials? Why not build higher, thicker, harder? Because permanence was not the only kind of legacy. Because to build with mud was to let the land speak. It was to accept that all things must return. And it was to create a home that remembered, not through what it endured, but through what it left behind. Long after the roofs collapsed and the walls dissolved, the soil beneath these homes began to whisper. Impressions remain, of woven mats, of footprints, of tools dropped and never recovered. Bones lie buried not in ceremony, but in quiet corners of domestic life. A child's jawbone beneath a hearth, a deer scapula with notches worn smooth from use. Even the floors, hardened by thousands of footsteps, tell a story, of who slept where, of where the fire burned brightest, of what was worth gathering close to. What happens when a wall becomes a journal, when the texture of a house holds the fingerprints of generations? In some rare sites, fossilised impressions in daub capture even the negative spaces, the shape of a missing beam, the curve of a basket once hung too long in one place. We do not need writing to understand that these were living homes, layered with activity and memory. Every repair was an annotation, every patch was an editorial, every wall a living manuscript of time, and when the daub fell, when rains or abandonment took their slow toll, the material did not vanish, it merged into midden heaps, into the sediment, into the archive of the earth itself. Archaeologists today scrape and sift these fragments, not to reconstruct buildings, but to reconstruct lives, and in doing so, they remind us that the earth remembers what we forget, that the humblest structure can outlast the tallest tower. Why, if only we learn how to read the mud, because what we find pressed into those packed earth floors, those collapsed walls of daub and ash, are not just artifacts, they are moments, gestures, paused, stories, paused, a single heel print hardened by the sun beside the outline of a sleeping dog, a fingertip groove where someone once smoothed wet clay with care, the edge of a woven mat perfectly preserved by the fire that once consumed the home it warmed. These are not ruins, these are recordings, not made with ink or stylus, but with the quiet weight of repetition and daily life. The physical structure of these homes, wattle, daub and mat, was never meant to last forever, but within their decay they preserved what permanence often erases: nuance, texture, trace. When homes are made from stone, they stand too long, lose the voice of their makers, but when built from living, breathing earth, they crumble slowly and carefully, catching pieces of the world they held as they go, like a photograph exposing itself over centuries. And there is something else the earth captures: absence. At sites like the Costa site in Illinois or Poverty Point in Louisiana, we find packed earth surfaces where no walls remain, but the floor tells us everything. Not through what is present, but through what is missing. The slight dips where posts once stood, the subtle gradient of ash where fire smouldered long ago. The outlines of perishable objects like baskets or hide sleeping mats, gone in form but preserved in their voids. These negative spaces are not empty. They are full of meaning. They are the memory of material. This is the archaeology of breath, and it brings us closer to those who once called these dwellings home. It reminds us that for millennia, humans built shelters not to dominate the landscape, but to blend with it. Woven reed walls flexed in the wind. Mats rolled and unrolled with the seasons. Clay cracked in patterns that echoed the parched riverbeds nearby. These weren't failures of construction. They were alignments. These structures responded, adjusted, remembered, and within that responsiveness they became more than architecture. They became expressions of identity. Because just as language can be a dialect of place, so too can building. A mat woven of cattail tells us not only what was available, but what was chosen. A wall packed with ash and dung tells us what was burned, what was sacred, what was waste. A doorway shaped to catch morning light speaks of more than function. It speaks of meaning, ritual, intention. Every community had its pattern. Some used tightly spaced vertical posts. Others preferred horizontal lacing. Some built thick daub walls for warmth. Others left open lattices to breathe. and over time these choices became signatures. You could walk from one valley to another and, by the pattern of a roofline or the twist of a bundle, know exactly whose memory you were entering, whose story you were walking through. And in this way, the house became not just a place of shelter, but a vessel of identity, not fixed like a monument, but alive, evolving like language itself. Each layer of packed earth, each repaired crack in the wall, each mat laid and lifted told a story not only of necessity but of belonging. For when materials come from the land and return to it, they carry the voices of the people who shaped them. In this sense, the house was never mute. It was always speaking, through texture, through rhythm, through the softness of worn thresholds and the slope of hearth ash. Some oral traditions even speak of homes as beings. In many indigenous worldviews, the house is not separate from the human or the land, but an extension of both. The frame of the home is the skeleton of a memory. The roof is the skin of the season. The hearth is the heart, not just a place of fire, but of continuity, where ancestors once sat and where stories still gather like smoke. And though no books were written here, knowledge was stored, not in shelves, but in structure. Children learned by watching. Grandmothers taught through the motion of their hands, mixing daub, knotting reeds, smoothing walls. There was no blueprint, only memory. And that memory was embodied. To build a home was to remember your people. To patch a wall was to keep a lineage alive. In this way, architecture was not a skill. It was an inheritance. This inheritance passed not through ownership, but through presence, through the gathering of hands, of eyes, of repetition. The act of building became a mnemonic device, a way of remembering one's place within a story that stretched back generations. You learned the strength of willow from your aunt, the pattern of windbreak from your grandfather, the art of letting clay rest from your older sister. Each home was slightly different, but the rhythm was shared. Even the smallest choices mattered. Where the sleeping mat was placed, how the door faced the morning, which wall held the ochre painting. These decisions, made in quiet conversation with weather and wind and kin, wove together the unseen threads of culture. And when visitors arrived, they could read the room, not in the modern sense of mood, but literally. They read the space like text, like story, like home. In this sense, architecture became oral tradition rendered in form. The home was a recitation. It had cadence. It had pause. It had inflection in the curve of its ceiling and metaphor in the placement of its fire. To walk into one was to be enveloped by meaning, not abstract, but lived, not static, but sung. And just as songs shift slightly from singer to singer, so too did homes evolve, adapting to the body that built them, to the needs of that particular moment in time, while still echoing the forms and memories of all who came before. In this way, every home stood not in isolation, but as a stanza in a longer poem, a line spoken softly in the chorus of a people's becoming. And as the centuries passed, as dwellings were rebuilt again and again upon the same earth, the soil thickened with these verses, stratified not just with refuse and ash, but with memory, with choices repeated, with footprints over footprints, each generation stepping into the pattern left by those before. Archaeologists speak of this as cultural stratigraphy, a technical term. But what it really means is that memory has weight, that choices about how to cook, how to sleep, where to store tools, accumulate. They form layers, and those layers are not dead. They are the architecture of continuity. At some sites, like the ones found along the lower Mississippi or the Colorado Plateau, the layering is so deep that new dwellings seem to nest directly within the contours of the old. A new hearth is placed in the shadow of the old one, perhaps without even knowing. The doorway opens where another once did. The placement feels right, not because a map says so, but because memory whispers from the earth itself. And it is not just function that repeats, it is meaning. For instance, symbolic designs etched in clay or painted onto daubed walls speak to more than just decoration. Spirals, handprints, or repeated lines suggest cosmological significance, social roles, or prayers made visible. These were not simply aesthetic choices, they were expressions of relationship between people, spirits, animals, and the land. A child born beneath a handprint wall might be told a story every time they looked up, A guest arriving at a doorway flanked by certain symbols would know what kind of household they were entering. Generous, fierce, grieving, joyful. The house became a storyteller, and every patch, every painting, every worn threshold added to its tale. In some cultures, homes were even ritually killed, burned at the end of their use, not in abandonment, but as a kind of respectful farewell. The structure had served, had held memory, had sheltered laughter and loss, and now, like a body, it returned to the elements. This too was part of the cycle. A home was never meant to last forever. It was meant to live just long enough to matter. And still, its memory remained. In the carbon stains of fire pits, in the fragments of painted plaster buried beneath silt, in the slightly blackened patch of soil where food was cooked for generations. These remnants become legible not through blueprints, but through attunement, through listening, through seeing not only what is left, but what is absent, and why that absence still feels so full. For in these vanished homes, in their bones of willow and coats of mud, we glimpse the full arc of human intention. To make shelter not only for the body but for the spirit, to live in a way that leaves a trace, soft, earthen, and unforgettable. And perhaps this is the quiet genius of these ancient dwellings. They taught us that a home does not need to endure to be remembered. It only needs to hold meaning long enough to pass it on, long enough for hands to learn the shape of walls, long enough for stories to take root beside the hearth, long enough for children to grow within its rhythms and carry them, unbroken, into the next shelter they build. Homes made of mud, bone, and woven mat were never meant to stand against centuries of weather. They were designed to vanish the moment they were no longer needed, freeing the land to breathe again. Yet in their disappearance they revealed a truth far older than architecture. That memory is not bound to permanence, it is bound to attention. You can see this truth in the faintest marks. A pattern of burned earth where a floor collapsed inward. A curve in the soil where a wall once bowed outward after a heavy rain. The ghost of a woven mat imprinted into hardened clay. These are not structural elements. They are memories, caught like breath in the moment before they disappear. And because the materials were humble, the memories are intimate. We see not the ambitions of rulers, but the gestures of ordinary lives. A child's hand pressed into wet daub, perhaps playfully, perhaps intentionally. A dropped bead buried beneath a floor, lost for a moment and found centuries later. The heel print of someone who rose quickly from sleep, startled, perhaps, or late for a morning task. There is nothing grand here, nothing monumental, and that is why it is so powerful, because the architecture of bone and mud was never about impressing others. It was about belonging, to a community, to a place, to a lineage of hands that knew how to mix clay with grass until it held. In these homes, oral tradition was not recited apart from daily life. It was baked into the walls, embedded in the floor, etched in the soot above the hearth. Story and shelter were inseparable, each reinforcing the other. To patch a wall was to repeat a teaching. To rebuild a roof was to return a memory. To sweep a floor was to touch the stories beneath your feet. Even today, when archaeologists piece together these dwellings from the smallest fragments, they are not reconstructing buildings. They are reconstructing relationships between humans and land, between generations, between the physical and the remembered. And the more we study them, the more we understand that architecture was never merely functional. It was cultural, moral, emotional, a thread that bound people to their ancestors and descendants alike. In the end, what survives is not the wall itself, but the way it was made. Not the mat, but the pattern. Not the home, but the memory of hands shaping earth into meaning. And perhaps this is the quiet legacy these ancient builders offer us, that a home is not what stands for the longest time, but what stays with us, even after it has returned to the soil. Even before the first beam was lifted or the hearth was lit, a house was never just a place to live, it was a place to become. This truth reveals itself slowly, like sunrise through smoke. In the ancient Americas, a home was not simply a structure to keep out wind and rain. It was a crucible of identity, a sanctuary of spirit, a stage for ceremony. And though nothing remains of those first wooden beams or woven roofs, we can still read their alignments, their placements, their patterns, echoes of an architecture that was more than shelter. It was myth, made habitable. What must it have meant to sleep each night aligned with the path of the sun? What kind of world emerges when your walls are placed not by accident, but in accordance with the solstice? At sites across the early Americas, from the high desert plateaus to the wooded river valleys, we find this recurring gesture: homes and structures built not merely for comfort, but for cosmic resonance. Some faced east to greet the rising sun. Others marked the position of stars or framed the longest and shortest days of the year, with doorways, posts, or shadows. These alignments were not decorative. They were devotional. They wove human lives into the great rhythm of the sky. Why orient your home to the heavens? Perhaps to ask for blessing. Perhaps to never forget your place in the order of things. Perhaps to draw the sky downward, into the daily business of boiling roots and weaving baskets, so that the ordinary might be touched by the eternal. These choices, simple, repeatable, precise, hint at a worldview where shelter was never separate from ceremony. The home was a cosmogram, a map of the unseen. Some structures were built in circles, others in squares, but neither form was arbitrary. Circles mirrored the sun, the moon, the seasonal cycle, the circle of kin around a fire. Squares reflected directionality: north, south, east, west, invoking balance, order, the four winds, the four stages of life. The very shape of a home told a story about the world and the people's place within it. It whispered cosmology in the language of architecture. Even the central fire was not simply functional. It was often positioned with reverence as the beating heart of the dwelling. Around it, stories were told, prayers were offered, births happened, mourning took place. The hearth was not just warm, it was sacred. And above it, smoke rose like spirit, connecting the ground with the sky in a single breath. How do you live when your shelter is a symbol? How do you move through space when every direction has meaning? How do you dream when even your sleeping mat rests on sacred geometry? In these ancient dwellings, ceremony was not something that happened apart from life. It was embedded within it. The home was not just a container for rituals, it was the first and most enduring ritual of all. And perhaps that's why, in so many early American homes, the past quite literally lay beneath one's feet. Because in these ancient structures, the sacred wasn't only above, it was below. Across the continent, archaeological evidence reveals a practice that is as intimate as it is profound. Burials placed beneath the floors of homes, infants, elders, ancestors, carefully interred within the living space, not out of neglect but out of love. Not cast away but kept close. A house was not just a place for the living, it was a dwelling shared across time. Imagine kneeling to stoke a fire knowing your grandmother rested in the earth below you. Imagine a child learning to walk above the bones of their great-grandfather. What does it mean to live in a home layered with memory? Not metaphorically, but physically? For these ancient people, death was not departure, but deepening. A deepening of presence, of relationship, of place. The walls remembered, the floors remembered, and so did the people who slept upon them. Burial beneath the home was more than convenience. It was communion. These ancestors weren't simply mourned. They were honoured, integrated, invited to remain. Their presence shaped the emotional architecture of the space. Each home became a shrine, not of marble or gold, but of dust and devotion. It was the hearth and the grave, the now and the before coexisting in silence. In this context, even the act of building a new shelter became ceremonial. You weren't just raising a structure, you were setting the bones of a new story, a new lineage. Sometimes the same site was reused again and again, each new home layered above the last like sediment, like song. This was not seen as strange, it was seen as continuity. A family wasn't just linked by blood, but by the shared weight of earth. To live together meant to remain together, in life and after. This spiritual intimacy extended outward. In some traditions, certain parts of the house were designated for specific beings, not just people, but spirits, ancestors, even animals with sacred meaning. A north wall might be associated with dreaming, a southern post with protection. The orientation of sleeping mats could be prescribed by age, role, or spiritual alignment. Every placement had resonance, nothing was random. In Pueblo traditions, for instance, the kiva, a ceremonial subterranean room, echoes these ideas. Though not a domestic space per se, its architectural symbolism teaches us how deeply space could be imbued with story. Entering a kiva was an act of returning, back through the symbolic sipapu, the opening that connects this world to the previous one. The home, like the kiva, could be a place of emergence, of storytelling, of sacred repetition. So when we speak of home as ceremony, we are not speaking in metaphor. We are pointing to a truth carved in clay and dust, that shelter was a spiritual act, that to build was to believe, that to dwell was to dream, with one foot in this world and one in the next. And this is what transforms a shelter into something far larger than its beams or walls. The home was not only a dwelling, but a model of the universe, a microcosm, a small living mirror of the world's great architecture. Across early American cultures, this pattern appears again and again, the belief that the world itself has structure and that human structures should echo it. The home was not an imitation of nature, it was participation in it. In some regions, the floor of the home symbolized the underworld, the place of origins, of ancestors, of the deep. The walls represented the middle world, the realm of humans, animals, and the everyday journey. And the smoke hole or roof opening represented the sky world, the place of spirits, of celestial beings, of guidance from above. To sit beside the fire was to sit at the axis between realms. To look upward through the vent was to glimpse the path of prayers rising. This was not abstract philosophy. It was lived reality. A mother grinding grain on a packed earth floor was not simply preparing food. She was working upon the oldest layer of existence. Children listening to stories beneath a roof open to stars were not merely being entertained. They were learning how the cosmos was shaped and how they fit within it. Every home was a diagram, but one felt through daily life rather than studied from afar. Even the materials carried cosmic meaning. Wood, drawn from forest beings. Clay, drawn from the bones of the earth. Straw, pulled from the fields that marked the boundary between wildness and human tending. These weren't resources, they were relations. To build a home was to gather pieces of the universe and invite them to cooperate. A roof beam was not just a roof beam, it was a sky-holding branch. A hearthstone was not just a stone, it was a point of connection, a grounding presence. Every component had a story, and through its story a function. This cosmological layout was not limited to houses alone. Villages, too, often reflected cosmic order. Circular settlements echoed cycles of time. Plazas served as the world's navel, the central point around which life revolved. Pathways aligned with solstice shadows or lunar patterns. Even trash heaps took on ritual shape, becoming rings, mounds, or crescents. Nothing was merely practical. Everything held layers. Everything meant something. And by living inside these meanings, people lived inside a story of the universe. A child growing up in such a house didn't need to be taught cosmology explicitly. They inhabited it. They learned the world's structure by moving through its metaphors, by sleeping beneath the sky hole, by stepping carefully over an ancestor's resting place, by watching shadows crawl along the wall and knowing that this too was part of the great rhythm. In this way, the home shaped not only life but thought, not only memory but worldview. It taught quietly and constantly that humans lived inside a structured, sacred world, and that every act, even the smallest one, had a place within that larger order. And still, the intimacy of this worldview extended beyond cosmic alignment, beyond ancestral burial. It infused even the most ordinary gestures. Because if the home mirrored the world, then every act within it echoed something sacred. Sweeping the floor was not just tidying, it was clearing the path for spirits. Lighting the fire was not just warmth, it was kindling the breath of creation. Even silence could be a kind of prayer if it fell in the right place at the right time. There are clues in the archaeological record, patterns of wear near hearths, carefully repeated thresholds, objects placed and replaced with subtle precision, that suggest ritualized behavior so deeply woven into daily life that it likely went unnoticed by those performing it. Just as we might knock on wood or speak softly in a church without thinking, early peoples likely observed patterns of movement and placement that were both practical and sacred. These weren't rituals set apart from life. They were life, simply lived with attention. And within this quiet ceremonialism, dreams had a place too. Among many indigenous traditions, dreams are not dismissed as meaningless visions. They are messages, maps, warnings, guides. To dream inside a cosmologically aligned home, surrounded by ancestors, beneath a roof open to the stars, is to receive wisdom from the layered worlds. The home itself became a cradle for these dreams, a place where the boundary between waking and sleeping, between spirit and skin, grew thin. One can imagine how the shape of a home might influence these dreams, how the rise of smoke along a roof beam, or the soft creak of woven walls, might become part of the language of the unconscious. The placement of a bed, the nearness to a fire, the coolness of earth beneath, all of it composing the landscape of a dream world in concert with the physical one. And perhaps in this way, the home became not only a mirror of the cosmos, but of the mind. In such homes, children grew up learning not just how to build shelter, but how to read meaning. They absorbed the language of gesture, of space, of orientation. They learned that walls could teach, that corners could listen, that thresholds mattered. They learned when and where to speak, and when and where to be still. And they carried this knowledge with them into new homes, new generations, layering old meaning onto new earth. This transmission was not through scrolls or blueprints, but through presence, through repetition, through doing. A grandmother showing how to arrange the firestones, a father explaining why a door faces east, a sibling reminding you not to step over the bones of the dead too casually. This was architecture as apprenticeship, not of buildings, but of being. To build a home, then, was to remember. To live in one was to rehearse the old stories with the body, and to sleep within it was to dream them forward. Because a ceremonial home was not frozen in tradition. It was alive. Not fixed like stone, but rhythmic like breath. As generations passed, new structures would rise, not as revolutions, but as continuations. Each home slightly different, each layout an echo with its own inflection. And in that continuity, something rare was preserved. A living cosmology. One that adapted without forgetting. One that welcomed change while honouring roots. In some regions, ceremonial spaces even evolved beyond the individual home. Communal dwellings, longhouses, kivas, council lodges, became shared sanctuaries of meaning. Here, ritual expanded outward. The structure itself became the body of a collective, with each family or clan forming part of a greater whole. A shared roof, a shared story, a place where feasts were held, songs were offered, conflicts were resolved, not only because there was space, but because there was meaning in gathering. Even today, remnants of these homes speak in quiet ways. Charred soil beneath an ancient hearth, a cluster of stones laid in deliberate shape, shells placed beside a doorway, none of it accidental, all of it intentional. And when archaeologists gently brush soil from these old foundations, they are not just uncovering buildings, they are uncovering belief. They are dusting off the outlines of a worldview where to build was to bless, and to dwell was to remember the shape of the sacred. And perhaps this is what still resonates so deeply about these homes. Not their endurance, but their intimacy. They were made with materials that decay quickly, but they encoded ideas that endure, that place matters, that orientation matters, that the world has rhythm and our lives can follow it, that where we lay our head, where we light our fire, where we bury our dead, these things shape not only our survival, but our sense of belonging. In a modern world where architecture often speaks the language of utility or spectacle, these ancient shelters whisper something else entirely. They remind us that shelter is not just about protection, it is about reflection, about seeing the world outside mirrored in the space within, about building not just for the body, but for the soul. And so, as we step out of these dwellings of ceremony, imagined now only in outlines and impressions, we carry something with us, a different kind of blueprint, one written not on paper, but in practice, in memory, in the knowledge that to create a home is also to create a world, because the first homes of the Americas were never simply shelters. They were prayers you could walk inside. They were myths shaped in earth and smoke. They were maps of the heavens stitched into the ground, and they ask us gently, what would it mean to build again? Not for permanence, but for meaning. Not for domination, but for connection. Not to rise above the world, but to belong more deeply to it. That question lingered in the air like a breath held too long, because the world itself was about to change. Not gradually, not gently, but with a force so sudden and so absolute that it tore through the very idea of home. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate lurched. The warmth that had been spreading across the continent, coaxing grasslands open, melting glaciers, inviting life to flourish, snapped back into cold. This was the Younger Dryas, a return to near-glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. A winter that reasserted itself, a world remembering how to freeze. What must it have felt like for the first Americans, having taken tentative steps toward belonging, to watch the land shift beneath them once more? Rivers that had run free tightened under ice. Plants that had begun to creep northward died back. Animals altered their migrations or vanished entirely. And humans, clever, resilient, hopeful, stood in the middle of this continental shudder, trying to understand what it meant that the world could take back comfort so quickly. How do you hold on to the idea of home when the climate itself becomes a trial? Shelters that once made sense in warmer times became liabilities. Pit houses that had been cosy during periods of mild winter now struggled against deepening cold. Mobile structures, so elegant on the open plains, buckled against harsher winds. The continent was transforming, and architecture, the quiet companion of human thought, had to transform with it or be left behind. This was the ordeal at the centre of the hero's journey, the moment when everything familiar is tested, and the creatures who had once shaped these landscapes alongside humans were facing their own trials. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, the towering short-faced bear, the megafauna that for tens of thousands of years had woven their paths across the continent, began to vanish. Whether driven by climate, by hunting, or by a combination of forces, their absence reshaped everything. For mobile peoples who followed herds, their disappearance was not just ecological, it was existential. It was a quiet erasure of an entire way of being. What happens to a dwelling tradition when the world it responded to dissolves? For some cultures, mobility became harder to sustain. The trails they had followed for seasons no longer held the same promise. The world of abundance became a world of scarcity, and with scarcity came innovation, or collapse. Some groups adapted by seeking stability where they could find it, in river valleys, in pockets of rich soil, in places where seeds could be tended, stored, protected. The idea of home shifted. It became less about following the world and more about anchoring oneself against its volatility. And in that anchoring, the first fragile hints of agriculture began to emerge. Not as a triumph, but as a response, a way of staying alive when the old rhythms faltered. A quiet, cautious experiment with permanence in a world that had suddenly withdrawn its certainty. What better trial could there be for the human idea of belonging? The Younger Dryas was not just a cold snap, it was a rupture in rhythm. And out of this rupture came necessity. With old ecosystems collapsing and familiar food webs fraying, people had to reimagine what it meant to inhabit a place. If they could not follow animals, perhaps they could stay still and grow something. If their light brush dwellings were no longer sufficient, perhaps thicker, heavier walls were the answer. The continent, once so welcoming in its richness, had grown severe, and survival demanded new ways of building, of being. The seeds of agriculture, quite literally asked, began to sprout in this crucible. Not everywhere, and not all at once. But in the arid southwest and parts of Mesoamerica, we begin to see early forms of plant tending. Squash, gourds, later maize. These were slow experiments, not revolutions, and with them came new forms of architecture. More permanent, more grounded. Pit houses became deeper, walls became thicker. Storage rooms were carved out for seeds, roots, and grain. A new kind of relationship with the land was forming, one built not on movement, but on staying, and staying required shelter that could endure. This shift marked the slow fading of some mobile lifeways. Not all, many persisted, adapted, transformed. But in the archaeological record, we begin to see a growing contrast. Homes designed to vanish and homes designed to remain. The architectural divide mirrored a deeper cultural question. Is it better to move with the land, or to make the land move with you? Yet even those who stayed were not guaranteed stability, because the land itself was still shifting. Floods surged through new valleys as glacial meltwaters burst free. Droughts pinched regions into famine. Volcanoes erupted, reshaping entire landscapes. In some places, whole communities disappeared, not because of war, but because the land could no longer hold them. The trials of belonging were ecological as much as they were cultural. But these trials didn't just destroy, they provoked ingenuity. In response to uncertainty, architecture evolved. Some early farmers dug their pit houses deeper into hillsides, using the thermal mass of earth to regulate temperature. Others began to construct above-ground dwellings with stone foundations, not yet cities, but villages of sturdier form. Adobe, packed clay, and stone began to supplement older materials. We see the emergence of architectural planning, however subtle. Rooms organised around shared courtyards, hearths aligned to catch the morning sun, pathways worn into permanence. Technology, too, evolved in tandem with dwelling. Grinding stones became essential household tools. Pottery began to appear, first as simple vessels, later as elaborately decorated objects, capable of storing grain, boiling stew, holding water. And with pottery came the ability to plan ahead, to store surplus, to imagine a future beyond the next hunt. Architecture under duress is not merely reactive, it becomes a way of thinking. It reflects a people who have stared into the eyes of a chaotic world and said, "We will build anyway. We will endure. We will adapt." And that quiet defiance, expressed not through monuments, but through walls of mud, floors of stone, ceilings of woven reed, became the architecture of resilience. This was not the resilience of empire or conquest, but of continuity, of people finding new ways to stay human in a world no longer offering guarantees. Through every design choice, through every modest innovation, they answered the same question. How do we belong to a land that does not promise to stay the same? For many, the answer was flexibility within rootedness. In the southwest, for instance, early agriculturalists began constructing semi-subterranean pit houses with ventilation shafts and internal hearths. Dug into the earth for warmth and topped with wooden frameworks, these homes balanced permanence and adaptability. If needed, they could be abandoned or rebuilt nearby. But while they stood, they served as the nucleus of family and memory, insulated both thermally and spiritually from the chaos beyond. Others moved toward new materials. In regions where stone was abundant, people began stacking it, carefully, logically, into circular rooms, kivas, and linear dwellings. These were the seeds of a later monumental traditions, but in this era they remained humble. The goal wasn't scale, it was shelter, strength, coherence. And all the while, technologies whispered their quiet revolutions. Pottery, once a novelty, became central to the home. Clay allowed people to extend the life of their labour, to preserve, to ferment, to cook more efficiently. Its presence suggests not only agriculture, but a changing rhythm of a life, one that could support waiting. Where a mobile hunter might consume meat quickly before it spoiled, a pot-owning cultivator might store grain for leaner times. The home now was not just a shelter from weather, it was a shelter from time's unpredictability. This new tempo, this slow architecture, encouraged different kinds of sociality. Communities grew in place. Generations began layering memory upon memory in shared spaces. Old fire pits became new foundations. Broken pottery was buried in walls, not as trash, but as lineage. A cracked bowl, kept in the corner of a house, might have belonged to a grandmother. A stone placed beneath the threshold might mark the birth of a child. These were not grand symbols, they were personal, tender inscriptions of presence. But for some groups, staying was still not the answer. Even amid growing agricultural zones, many peoples continued to move, across plains, through forests, along coasts, and their homes reflected this choice. Lightweight structures, seasonally rebuilt, hide, tents, brush shelters, snow lodges. The persistence of mobility was not a failure to adapt, but a parallel adaptation. Not all resilience looks like roots. Some resilience is the refusal to be fixed. And that is the deeper truth of this time. There was no single path forward. The trials of belonging scattered people in many directions, some toward fields and courtyards, others toward migration routes and riverbanks. But all of them, in their own way, were answering the same unspoken question. How do we remain ourselves when the world reshapes everything we knew? The answer, in part, was not just in what people built, but in how they built together. The ordeal of climate change, Ecological upheaval and cultural transformation wasn't born in isolation. These were collective trials, and architecture became a collective act. In villages where people settled more permanently, the construction of a home was not a solitary task. It was a gathering. Neighbours hauled stone, extended families packed earth, elders remembered where not to build, children fetched water from nearby springs, and fire was carried from one hearth to the next to consecrate a new beginning. The structure then was not only made of material, it was made of relationship, of effort layered with memory, of choices shaped by experience and offered to others. And this was key. Resilience was not merely about innovation or endurance. It was about sharing what worked and knowing that survival meant adaptation held in common. Archaeological evidence points to how ideas spread across regions in this time. Similar dwelling types begin to appear in distant places, not identical, but echoing each other. A way of venting smoke here, a new way of anchoring thatch there. These weren't the marks of a single culture expanding. They were signs of learning, of networks alive with exchange, knowledge passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, story to story. Shelter was no longer just personal. It had become cultural currency. But what also evolved, quietly, necessarily, was a new emotional relationship to home. Earlier, in the deep past, shelter had been a pause in motion, a temporary resting point before the next pursuit. But now, for many, home was where the seasons turned, where a harvest rose from the same soil year after year, where a burial under the floor might never be moved. These were not just buildings, they were anchors in time, monuments not to glory but to return, to cycles, to kin. And yet, that permanence carried a cost. Droughts now had more power. A poor harvest could not be outrun, water sources could dry, fields could fail, homes, once trusted to hold the future, became fragile, and in this way the ordeal deepened. Because now belonging was not only about adapting to the land, it was about wrestling with its unpredictability. One year's stability could become the next year's peril. This fragility sparked further ingenuity. In flood-prone areas, houses were built on higher ground. In drought-affected regions, communities dug channels to capture runoff, reshaping the land to serve habitation. Some began to build granaries, raised, sealed, protected, to buffer themselves against the risk of famine. The home was now not only a shelter, not only a symbol, but it was a strategy, a container for uncertainty. And so, under pressure, a new kind of architecture emerged. Not rigid, not ornate, but intelligent, responsive, tuned to the land's changes and to the memory of change. It whispered of hardship, yes, but also of refusal, a refusal to surrender the dream of belonging. And perhaps that is what defines this moment in the long human journey. Not the scale of the structures, nor the sophistication of tools, but the resilience of hope. Even in the face of cold, famine, disappearance, and ecological unravelling, people kept building, kept shaping walls, kept placing hearths, kept believing that the land, even when unstable, could still be a home, if not forever, then for now. It is tempting to read this time as one of the loss, the extinction of great animals, the disappearance of long-held traditions, the breaking of migratory rhythms that once defined the world. But to see only loss is to overlook what rose in its place. Not dominance, but dialogue. Humans were not imposing upon the continent. They were in conversation with it. Each adaptation, each architectural choice was an answer to a question the land had asked. And those answers were not uniform. In some places, the homes dug into the ground grew deeper, more communal. In others, structures rose on platforms lifted above flooding plains. In still others, materials changed. Stone giving way to clay giving way to timber giving way to woven mats. There was no blueprint, only memory. No master plan, only ancestral intuition. From this era, the traces are often faint. Wall lines blurred beneath centuries of sediment. Post holes darkened in the soil. Fragments of pottery, scorched bones, ashes from long-dead fires. But if we listen closely, these remnants speak, not in the language of precision, but in the voice of persistence. They tell us, we stayed, we tried, we made this place again and again, our own. And for those who moved on, for those whose lifeways could not be tethered, The ordeal left marks too. Their dwellings may not have fossilized in stone, but they evolved nonetheless. More efficient shelters, smarter use of animal hides, faster ways to set up and break down camps. In this trial, they learned to sharpen their mobility, to move not just quickly, but wisely. Their architecture was not rooted, but agile, a resilience born from knowing the world cannot always be asked to hold still. As we look back now, across this threshold in prehistory, from a time of movement into a time of dwelling, from reaction into intention, we see that this was not a simple crossing. It was a crucible, a test not of strength, but of continuity. What survived were not just techniques, but values, flexibility, memory, attention, care. The idea that a home is more than shelter, it is a stance toward the world. And so, as the younger Dryas gave way to warming again, and the seeds of agriculture took deeper root, and architecture began its slow march toward towns, villages, cities, something essential remained. A memory shaped in clay and ash, and silence. That to dwell is to listen, that to build is to remember, and that even in a world of trial, belonging is still possible, if we're willing to meet the land again and again where it changes. When we speak of ruins, we often picture stones collapsed into earth, silent cities reclaimed by time, monuments fractured by centuries. But some ruins are not physical. They live in memory, in whispers, in practices that remain even after their names have faded. They survive not as walls but as gestures, as stories, as rhythms of survival passed from breath to breath. And in the architecture of the first Americans, in what was kept and what was lost, this quieter endurance takes form. Across the wide, beating heart of the North American continent, echoes still linger. The conical sweep of the teepee, anchored to the earth with sacred symmetry. The curved intimacy of a wigwam's arched frame, woven from sapling and skin, shaped by knowledge so old it predates all ink. The dug-in warmth of a pit house, earth-wrapped and sun-faced, remembering every cold wind it ever held at bay. These were not curiosities of a vanished world. These were, and in many places still are, living testaments to relationship, to place, to season, to spirit. How do such designs endure across millennia? Not through blueprints or archives, but through the body, through hands that remember and eyes that know where the wind comes from, through the hush of a winter fire where a grandparent teaches not with words, but with movements. How to bend a willow, how to lash a joint, how to make a shelter speak with the voice of the land itself. This is continuity not of shape alone, but of meaning. For indigenous nations who have lived through colonization, erasure, and removal, the tipi or longhouse or mat lodge is more than a building. It is a declaration, a breath of cultural sovereignty, a structure that says, we are still here, we still know, we still build, and yet not all was kept. What happens when wisdom is severed from its lineage? When the keepers of memory are silenced, displaced, or stripped of the land that gave their homes meaning? Across the last 5 centuries, the collision of worlds brought not just violence and disease, but an intentional dismantling of architecture as a system of knowledge. Settler colonialism did not merely replace old homes with new ones. It rewrote the idea of what a home could be. Boarding schools forbade language and tradition. Ploughs overturned sacred spaces. Governments outlawed ceremonies that had once centered around hearths and seasonal shelters. The materials were dismissed as primitive, the forms as disposable, the thread frayed. In many places it snapped, but not completely, because something stubborn remained. A curve remembered in a bent branch, a direction chosen without knowing why, just that it felt right. A lullaby sung near a doorway built to face the morning sun. This is how memory resists, not always loudly, but faithfully. Beneath the loss, beneath the silence, something continues to hum. So what does it mean to build now, on land where so much has been forgotten? How do you recover what was meant to vanish? And who decides what is worth recovering? Across native communities today, these questions aren't abstract. They are woven into architecture itself. They arise in conversations between elders and youth, in workshops where ancient techniques are practiced again, in community gatherings where designs are sketched not just for shelter, but for cultural renewal. In these spaces, to build is to remember, not just what a home looked like, but what it meant to dwell together, to face the wind as kin, to find balance between the seen and the unseen. Take the teepee, for example. Its simplicity deceives. It is not a cone for sleeping, it is geometry and dialogue with place. Its smoke flaps adjust to wind direction. Its entrance often faces the rising sun. Its poles follow cosmological rules tied in a precise order, each representing principles of life. And its assembly is not an individual task, but a communal rite. In its full expression, a teepee teaches not only how to live, but how to be, with others, with land, with sky. In the Pacific Northwest, cedar longhouses, built large enough to shelter entire extended families, still rise beside rivers. Their planks are carved, painted, their beams telling stories older than language. These homes, often part of village complexes, were never just shelters from rain. They were places of protocol, of naming ceremonies and winter dances, of oratory and decision. Each architectural choice was bound to social structure, wide enough for gathering, dark enough for transformation, open enough for listening. But for every memory kept alive, there are others scattered like ash on the wind, structures lost not because they were flawed, but because the systems that supported them were dismantled. Knowledge that once passed through apprenticeship, migration and ritual, interrupted by policies, borders and forced resettlements. The seasonal cycle, once a map for when and how to build, was broken by the imposition of fixed property lines and foreign calendars. To be indigenous was to be criminalised, and with that, indigenous design, responsive, sacred, embodied, was suppressed, rebranded as quaint or obsolete. Even so, the echo never fully faded. In recent years, many communities have begun to reweave that severed thread, not as reconstruction, but as continuation. Young architects learning from elders, language learners rediscovering terms for tools, for timbers, for hearths, harvesting reed, bark, hide, not for a museum, but for use. These acts, humble and intentional, are not revival. They are resistance, they are repair. And in this repair, something vital is learned, that home was never just a structure. It was and is a ceremony of belonging, a way to inhabit a world in relationship, to live not above the land, but within its breath and memory. This is what was nearly lost. But it was not. Not entirely. And what remains can still be honoured, still be built again, not exactly as before, but in continuity with what mattered. And this is perhaps the most profound lesson that prehistoric homes, and their descendants, still offer us today. The understanding that continuity does not mean replication. It means resonance. It means carrying forward the values beneath the structure, even as the shape evolves. It means knowing that a home is not sacred because of what it is made of, but because of what it allows: gathering, rest, memory, and meaning. In many ways, indigenous architecture across the Americas has always been more than its materials. Yes, the hides, the bark, the saplings, the packed earth and ash, these were essential. But the true framework was relational. Homes were designed not just for survival, but for story. They faced east not by accident, but to greet the returning sun. Their entrances and hearths were placed with care, marking cycles of ceremony and time. The fire in the centre was not merely heat. It was the axis of a world. These principles have never entirely disappeared. In native-led housing initiatives today, you can still see them. Not always in the same forms, but in the same spirit. Circular layouts that echo traditional cosmology. Shared spaces that resist the isolating logic of Western design. Earth-based materials that breathe and change with the seasons. Architecture, once again, as relationship. To the land, to the ancestors, to the unseen. But what about those who never learned these traditions? Those whose ancestry traces back not to this continent, but to ships and crossings and migrations of another kind? Are they cut off from this thread? Not necessarily. Because the wisdom embedded in early American homes is not just for those who built them. It speaks to anyone willing to listen, to anyone who understands that a house is more than a shelter, and that the stories we build into our spaces shape who we become within them. This is where the invisible thread stretches forward, beyond pit houses and longhouses, beyond colonization and revival, into the present moment, into your moment, into how you live and how you build. Do your walls hold silence? Do they make room for gathering? Do they point you back to something older than your own memory? In a time where modern construction often prioritizes speed, efficiency, and profit over meaning or connection, these questions become more than nostalgic. They become necessary. What does it mean to build slowly? To build with care? To let the land have a say? Some indigenous communities are now using both ancestral and contemporary knowledge to address housing needs, not just for symbolism, but for well-being. Traditional forms are being adapted for modern use. Earth lodges with insulation upgrades, timber frames with contemporary plumbing, ceremonial spaces within public housing projects. These are not aesthetic gestures. They are reclamations of agency, healing, and continuity. Because to rebuild what was almost lost is to say, we remember. And more than that, we are still building. But even as this thread continues forward, there are places where it tangles, or frays, or becomes nearly invisible. In many modern landscapes, the structures that once echoed with ancestral knowledge have been replaced by homes that do not listen. To the seasons, to the sky, to the people within them. The geometry of belonging has been swapped for grids of efficiency. Concrete, drywall, plastic. Materials with no memory, no flexibility, no spirit. And yet, in the quiet corners of many indigenous homelands, older rhythms persist. Not always in architecture itself, but in the ways people move through space, in how a fire is tended, in where a child is placed to sleep, in which direction a family sits to share a meal. These may not be recognised by zoning boards or building codes, but they are acts of design nonetheless. Invisible blueprints, soft architecture, culture folded into gesture. What was lost in many cases was not just the form of the house, but the grammar of inhabiting. How to live with slowness. How to shape a structure around the needs of elders, of children, of ceremony. How to understand that impermanence is not a flaw, but a form of respect. A willingness to leave little behind, to let the land heal after you've gone. In this light, the homes of the first Americans become more than archaeological subjects. They become mirrors. They ask us what we have built, and whether it still serves us. They ask why loneliness echoes so loudly in modern walls, why so many shelters lack warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. These questions are not designed to shame. They are invitations to look closer at what we value, to ask if we are still designing for the human spirit, or just for function, to wonder if a house can still be a prayer, and some have begun to answer. Architects, artists, builders and storytellers are turning again to indigenous principles, not to appropriate but to learn. They are studying traditional spatial orientations, community-centered design, bioregional materials, climate responsiveness. They are looking at buildings as ecosystems, not machines. Not to return to the past, but to carry forward its deeper wisdoms, because what was lost was never completely gone. It lingered in dreams, in ceremonies, in the creases of songs. It slept in the memory of places where people once gathered, in the old fire pits now buried under new soil. It flickered in the stories of grandparents who remembered how their grandparents built. And now, as we listen more carefully, we begin to hear it again. The thread may be fine, but it is strong, and when we follow it, not with haste, but with humility, it leads us back to something quiet and essential. That a home is not just where we are safe, it is where we are known, and where we choose, again and again, to belong. This act of choosing, to root, to recall, to remake, is not just about shelter. It's about orientation, about aligning ourselves with something older than the modern world remembers. And though much has changed since the first footprints were pressed into the Americas' untamed soil, the core questions remain the same. How shall we live here? What shall we bring with us? And what must we leave behind? Among those first homes, made of hide, of bone, of bark and breath, there was no illusion of permanence. Instead, there was balance, a knowledge that survival did not come from conquering the land, but from listening to it. Dwellings were designed not to impose, but to harmonize. They followed the grain of the wind, the slope of the valley, the rhythms of herds and harvests. They were not separate from the world around them. They were part of its voice, and in some places that voice still whispers, in the teepee poles tied in ceremony, in the circular hearths dug into earth, in cedar planks split with reverence and aligned with the stars, in stories told over low fires in winter, when snow softens the outside world and memory gathers indoors. Each element, however modest, becomes a stitch in the fabric of identity. Of course, we live in a different time now, the pressures are different. The materials, the economies, the contexts, all altered, and yet the deepest needs have not changed. We still yearn for places that hold us, not just our bodies, but our stories, our griefs, our joys, our roots. In this, the wisdom of early American homes becomes not just relevant, but urgent, because there is something sacred in structures built for community rather than commodity, in shelters designed with awareness of sun, wind and season, in walls that remember, not through photographs or drywall, but through tradition and scent and use. These are the homes that do not just protect life, but reflect it. They hold memory not as archive, but as presence. What was kept, then, was not just the teepee or the lodge. It was the knowledge that our built world reflects our inner one, that how we shape space shapes us in return, that to dwell is not just to reside, it is to relate. And what was lost? A great deal, and some of it, perhaps, forever, but not all, because you are listening. And listening is the first act of return. You may not rebuild a pit house or stretch a skin over poles, but you can ask, what did my ancestors build and why? What do I carry? What could I learn from those who built with sky and silence in mind? This is the thread we follow through shelter and shadow, through memory and ruin. And even now, especially now, it leads us home. What is a home, really? We've followed its forms through time, from footprints pressed into mud to shelters spun from bone, from circular hearths of ancestors to longhouses dense with memory. But at the journey's end, the question becomes personal again, not archaeological, not architectural, intimate. In a world that was vast, wild and unknowable, the first Americans built not just for warmth or shelter, but for a kind of anchoring, a way to say, here, for now, we belong. And maybe that's all a home ever was, a promise, spoken softly to the land. But how does one belong to a continent in motion, ice melting, animals disappearing, rivers shifting their beds like dreamers unsettled in sleep? The people who walked into the Americas 15,000 years ago did not have deeds or fences or floor plans. They had movement, they had memory, and they had the earth beneath them, vast and unspeaking, inviting and unknowable. To make a home in such a place required something more than wood and fibre. It required attention, humility, a willingness to build not for eternity but for presence. Can you imagine it? Waking to the sound of elk passing in the distance, to the smell of ash still warm from last night's fire, to the creak of hide stretched over frame. No locks, no corners, no ceiling to keep the stars out. Just the breath of your family beside you and the slow revelation of morning light. A home was not separate from the world. It was the world, cradled and acknowledged, allowed to shape you as you shaped it. These people did not dwell in opposition to the land. They were part of its grammar. Their shelters followed the lines of the hills, the wind's corridors, the tilt of the sun at midwinter. They knew the language of shadows and silence, the meaning of a drift's depth, of where birds nested early in the season. To make a home was to collaborate with forces older than language. To borrow, never to take. But what happens to the idea of home when you're always moving? When belonging is not rooted in place but in practice? Among many early American peoples, permanence was not the point. The sacred did not require stone, meaning moved with the people, in stories and rituals, in the gestures repeated across seasons and landscapes. A hearth could be dug anew, a sleeping mat laid again. The home was not a building, it was a choreography, a set of remembered movements that turned raw earth into sanctuary. So the question turns again, not just what did they build, but how did they dwell? Because it is in that act, dwelling, that we find the thread back to ourselves, not through blueprints or ruins, but through imagining what it felt like to be held by a structure that asked nothing of the land but permission to stay. And when it was time to go, they left little behind except for memory. This too was a kind of wisdom, to leave no scars, no ruins, to walk away without fracture. In a modern world obsessed with leaving a mark, the first Americans teach us something else. That home does not require dominance, it requires intimacy, An intimacy begins with listening. They listened to the land, to the water, to the seasons breathing. And because they listened, they built with care. Not just in material, hide, reed, bark, stone, but in intention. There was no blueprint, only observation. They watched where snow melted first, where winds tunneled between ridges, where the sun pulled warmth even in the lean months. Their homes bent toward the earth's suggestions, not away from them. This is not nostalgia. It's architecture. Architecture that begins not with an idea, but with a question. What does this place ask of us? In that question lies humility, a trait too rarely associated with building. But for early peoples, humility wasn't a moral trait. It was survival. To impose a square house on a round hill was to invite collapse. To ignore the rhythm of the seasons was to wait cold and unprepared. So they tuned themselves to what the land already knew, and in doing so, they became part of it. Modern architecture often begins with defiance, a bold vision imposed on landscape. But what if design began instead with submission, with yielding? The early shelters we've explored were not dramatic. No towering spires, no carved facades. They were low to the ground, whisper thin, sometimes invisible within a few seasons, but in that lightness they carried something heavy, relationship. To build lightly is not to build weakly. It is to build in a way that knows when to let go. This brings us back to belonging. The first Americans belonged not because they had borders, but because they had rituals of return. A bend in a river, a stand of trees where game lingered. These became waypoints in a mental map, places where memory stacked year upon year. When a shelter was rebuilt, it was not an act of novelty. It was continuation. Home was not fixed, but it was familiar. And in that familiarity, a certain kind of emotional archaeology emerges. Imagine finding an ancient pit house depression, now softened with time. The roof is long gone, the hearth is filled with dust. But in that shallow circle, you feel something. Not just the presence of a structure, but the echo of choice. Someone once decided this was the place to gather, to rest, to listen to stories and storms. That choice lingers. It shapes how we interpret the past and how we consider our own spaces now. Because home, as the first Americans show us, is not just where we live. It is where we allow meaning to accumulate, where we return, not just in body, but in spirit. And perhaps that is what lasts the longest. Not the walls, not the roofs, but the residue of return, the way a place holds the weight of having mattered. Even after centuries, even after the wood has rotted and the bones of hearths have gone cold, the earth remembers. And if we pause long enough, so do we. This is the emotional archaeology of shelter, a way of understanding not through artifacts alone, but through wonder. A way of asking, not what was built here, but what was felt here. What kind of warmth radiated from this fire? What stories were shared in its glow? Who leaned against the frame of this now absent wall and looked out into the open dark, hearing wolves in the distance? There are no blueprints for these questions, no measurements, no diagrams, but they matter, because they remind us that architecture is not merely a structure, it is a container for experience. And experience, especially in a world without writing, was everything. The first homes were designed not only to keep people dry or warm, but to hold a kind of emotional ecology, a place where generations could remember together, where gestures became inherited, how to stack kindling, how to place a mat for sleeping, how to greet the morning with stillness. These were the floorboards of memory, even when there were no floors. We live now in a time of fixed foundations, of static addresses. But the early Americans lived in motion, and they carried home with them not just physically but emotionally. Their architecture was behavioural. It existed in how they moved, how they gathered, how they retreated, in how they noticed the land and responded with respect, not resistance. So what does that teach us? It teaches us that shelter, at its most profound, is a dialogue, not a monologue. We do not simply impose our will on a place. We converse with it. We listen to what it offers and what it refuses. And in doing so, we craft dwellings that are not just efficient but meaningful, not just weatherproof, but welcoming. That sense of welcome, of intimacy with place, is something we risk losing in our rush toward permanence. We insulate, we seal, we soundproof, and in doing so, sometimes we forget the voice of the wind, the whisper of temperature changes, the creak of timbers responding to the air. Early homes did not shut the world out. They filtered it, shaped it, let it in just enough to stay in conversation. That humility, to let the world in, is a kind of courage. It says, we do not fear the land, we are part of it. We are not above it, nor apart. We are participants, co-authors. The first Americans did not know what tomorrow would bring, but they knew how to arrive at it, together with reverence, and with structures that said less about conquest and more about care. That is what home meant. That is what it can mean again. But to return to that meaning requires more than admiration. It requires a reckoning. Because somewhere along the long arc of human history, the idea of home drifted. It became commodity, territory, a symbol of wealth rather than of belonging. But the first shelters of the Americas remind us that this was not always so. That home was once a verb, not a noun, something practiced, not possessed. This practice of homing, of crafting and recrafting space with tenderness, was deeply woven into lifeways. The wigwam, for instance, was not just a structure of saplings and bark. It was a dynamic rhythm between the land and the people. As seasons shifted, the home changed. As families grew or contracted, it flexed. Its very form was a reflection of attentiveness. Not efficiency, but attunement. To observe a wigwam being built is to witness a kind of choreography. Poles bent with care, bark panels stitched like clothing, every component chosen with specificity. These weren't just shelters, they were expressions of intimacy with the local ecology. The builders knew which tree had the right curve, which bark would breathe but not break. It was a kind of poetry in material form, verses written in ash and spruce and cord, and this was not unique. Across the continent, in pit houses and longhouses, teepees and thatched lodges, the same impulse emerged. Build with what you have, but even more, build with where you are. The result was not only practical, it was beautiful. Not ornamental beauty, but the quiet beauty of rightness. A structure that felt inevitable, not because it was imposed, but because it arose naturally from its place. These homes, however temporary they may seem to modern eyes, held permanence of another kind, cultural permanence. They passed down knowledge not through books, but through doing. A child who helped gather willow for a frame learned not just architecture, but ecology, responsibility, patience. A grandparent who traced the direction of wind taught engineering through touch. Each action embedded story. Each structure became a vessel for more than bodies. It carried spirit. And even now, when many of these traditions have been disrupted or obscured, traces remain. In the way some indigenous communities return each year to ancestral sites and rebuild old forms, in the songs sung around fire, in the knowledge passed from hand to hand, outside the reach of text. These are not relics, they are roots. So we ask again, what is a home? It is not square footage. It is not mortgage rates. It is not even walls and ceilings. Not really. It is the space we shape to hold our lives, and the way that space, in turn, shapes us. It is a relationship, a rhythm, a ritual. And once, long ago, the first Americans knew how to begin that ritual. Quietly, attentively, in tune with the breath of the land. They left us no monument, but they left us that. And perhaps that is the great gift of this long journey, the recognition that our first home was not a structure at all, but a way of seeing, a way of being. Long before blueprints, before walls that kept the world out, before permanence became the measure of value, humans understood that belonging is not anchored in the things we build, but in the attention we give. It is fitting, then, that the journey ends here, not in a place, but in a perspective. Think of the first Americans stepping into a continent no one had ever lived in. They did not claim it. They did not carve it into parcels. They moved through it with the curiosity and reverence of guests who hoped to stay, but only with permission. And when they built lightly, tenderly. Their shelters were as humble as they were wise, portable, adaptable, integrated into the land's breathing. A home was not a fortress. It was an embrace. This is not to say their lives were easy. They faced climates that shifted overnight, animals the size of houses, landscapes that reshaped themselves with ice and fire. But through all of it, they returned again and again to the same truth, that to dwell is to learn, and to learn is to listen. That lesson has not expired. Even now our walls are thick, our buildings tall, our lights so bright they blot out the stars. Yet something inside us still hungers for the quiet design of those first shelters, for spaces shaped by meaning rather than by market, for homes that breathe with us, instead of walling us off from the very world that sustains us. We ache for a hearth that is more than a decoration, for a doorway that greets the morning, for a place where memory can gather like smoke. And so the first Americans invite us into a different kind of reflection, a return not to their structures, but to their spirit. They remind us that belonging is not found in permanence, but in presence, that rootedness does not require staying still, it requires paying attention. That transience is not the opposite of home, it is one of its oldest shapes. If we follow that thread, that quiet, ancient thread, it leads us toward a new understanding of architecture, one where humility is a design principle, where materials are chosen for communion, not conquest, where the land is not backdrop but collaborator, where the home becomes, once again, a teacher. And in that teacher's voice, we recognize something startlingly familiar, a reminder that the first home we ever knew was the world itself, a world that offered shelter in ridges, warmth in fire, story in wind. The homes our ancestors built were echoes of that original embrace, attempts to honour the vastness around them while carving a small, meaningful place within it. So as we close this journey, the question lingers gently. What will your home echo? The fear of impermanence, or the wonder that first taught humans how to dwell? Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through ancestral architecture, for stepping gently through the shelters of the past and seeing, through their quiet walls, what it meant to be human at the edge of a new world. If this story brought you stillness, sparked a sense of wonder, or helped you see your own home with new eyes, thank you for being here. Your presence gives these ancient echoes a place to land. I wonder what part of this story will stay with you. A word, a sound, a shape. A fragment of shelter remembered not in wood or stone but in feeling. Whether it was the way mammoth bones curved into walls, the warmth of a firelit pit house, or the fragile beauty of footsteps pressed into ancient mud. These quiet pieces are what connect us, across time, across silence. If one of those fragments stayed with you, you're invited to share it in the comments below, as a quiet offering to others walking this path beside you. If you'd like to walk the next journey with us, into stories not often told but always felt, you can subscribe or simply return when you're ready. New chapters await. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful.